His face was lying in something hot and soft. Ash. Lots of ash. He tried to breathe and coughed so hard that tears sprang from his eyes. He braced his hands against the ground and struggled to get up on all fours. All around him were charred logs. The remains of the walls jutted out like the black ribs of a dead beast. A barn. It was a barn, or what was left of it. He raised his head and saw the sky. Gray, low, alien. It wasn't his sky. Not the Seoul sky with its neon glow over Gangnam. Not the sky above the factory parking lot where he'd been walking after his night shift. The last thing he remembered was the screech of brakes, the wheelchair rolling out from behind the van, his own hands pushing against the plastic side rail. Then the impact. Then nothing. And now, ashes. He looked at his hands. Young, with calluses in the wrong places. His calluses were on the pads of his fingers from the file and the screwdriver. These calluses were on his palms, from the hilt of a sword. Someone else's hands. Someone else's body. He was 20. He knew this from somewhere deep inside, just as he knew the name. Dane Velen. Not his name, not his life, but his hands. Now they were his. Fragments of someone else's memories floated through his mind. A mother with a long braid tied in a knot. A father in worn armor. A younger brother laughing on the shoulders of someone much larger. An oath. Some kind of oath sworn by the bedside. It was all blurry and distant, like a dream from which you remember only the feeling. His own memory stood beside it, sharp and clear. Formulas, blueprints, tolerances and fits. The moment of tightening. The coefficient of friction between steel and steel. All of it was with him. Everything, down to the very last set of notes. He stood up. He staggered. His body was weaker than it should be. A starving body, a battered body. He felt something was wrong with his left ribs. A crack or a severe bruise. It hurt to breathe. He looked around. Behind the remains of the barn stood a blacksmith shop. A small one, with a sagging roof, missing one wall. The forge was cold. The anvil was rusty. Tools were scattered on the ground. Someone had been rummaging around here, looking for something valuable. 3 children were sitting on the threshold of the blacksmith shop. The oldest girl was about 12. Her back was straight. Her eyes were dry. Her face looked as if she had already lived 40 years, and not a single one of them had been a good one. A boy of about 3 lay on her lap. He was asleep. His face was dirty. His fingers clutched the hem of her shirt. A second girl, about 8 years old, sat nearby. She was clutching a chipped clay pot to her chest. The pot contained ashes. Different ashes. Not from the barn. He knew that right away. They were cremated remains. Their mother had been buried that morning. He knew that too from somewhere deep inside. The older girl was looking at him. Not with hope. Not with fear. She looked the way one looks at the last wall in a house that hasn't fallen yet. You know it's going to fall. But as long as it's still standing, you can breathe. Daniel Coe, 29 years old, mechanical engineer, specialist in industrial presses and small hydraulic systems. Dead. Dane Wellen, 20 years old, heir to a destroyed lineage, the last man in the family. Alive. 2 people in one body, 1 pair of hands, 3 children on the threshold. He took a step toward them, then another. His knees buckled, but he kept walking. He approached them. He stood before the eldest. She looked up at him. He wanted to say that everything would be all right, but he couldn't promise that. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who was killing them. He didn't know if he'd live to see tomorrow. So he said something else. He said that no one else would die. He said, "Do you hear me? No one." He promised it. The oldest girl didn't cry. She just nodded. Once. Briefly. Like an adult. Like someone who had long since stopped believing, but decided to give it another try. The middle girl clutched her potty tighter. The little one on the oldest girl's lap didn't wake up. And Daniel thought, so this is how it works. No chosen hero. No gift from the gods. No system with levels and skills. 3 hungry children. A smithy without a roof. A village that would soon die. He had no magic. No army. No money. All he had was a mind filled with 400 years of industrial history, and hands, not his own, but strong. He turned toward the smithy. The roof had sagged, but the rafters were intact. The forge was half destroyed, but the base remained in place. The anvil was rusty but not cracked. He didn't see it the way a local blacksmith would. He saw the loads, the vectors of force, failure points. He saw that the left roof post had rotted at the base and was held up only because the right post had wedged it at an angle. If the wind blew any harder, the roof would collapse. But if he drove a prop in right here, at this angle, using that charred log that was still solid on the inside, the roof would hold. Not forever, but it would hold. He started with the roof. His first day in a new world. His first decision, not a sword, not revenge, not a search for answers. The roof. Because it would be cold at night, and the children needed to sleep warm. He found an axe among the scattered tools. A dull one, with a chip in the blade. The handle was cracked and wrapped with a leather strap. More like junk than a tool. But it would do. He chopped a support from the charred log. He whittled down the end. He hammered it into place under the roof beam with a rock because he couldn't find a suitable hammer. The roof creaked. It settled more evenly. Not perfect, but good enough. The oldest girl watched, silently, not offering to help, not getting in the way, just watching. He found out later that her name was Lyra, that the middle one was Theo, that the youngest was Ronan. He learned that their mother had died 3 days earlier from a wound inflicted when bandits raided the village. She'd been hiding with the children in the cellar. They found her. They beat her. The wound became infected. There was no doctor in the village. She had been dying for 2 days. Lyra sat by her side. He learned that their father had died earlier, a month ago. He'd ridden out to meet the bandits with 4 men from the village guard and never returned. Their bodies were found on the road, stripped of everything they owned. He learned that the village of Holmgard had a population of 43. There used to be 56. 13 had died in the last 2 months, some at the hands of bandits, some from starvation. Some had simply headed south and never returned. He learned that the nearest town was a 3-day journey away, that the war with Valharad had been going on for 4 years, that the royal army couldn't care less about the northern villages, that in a month or 2, Valharad raiding parties would reach this place. He learned all this on the first day, bit by bit, from an old man named Gort, who was something of a village elder, from the women who were cooking a thin soup made from roots over a communal fire, from a teenager with a bandaged arm who silently brought him water while he worked on the roof. A simple picture was emerging. The village is dead. It's still breathing, but it's already dead. A month's worth of grain left. Almost no livestock. Tools are broken or stolen. 9 men capable of working. The rest were old people, children, and women who had just enough strength to make it through until evening. A month. Maybe 2. Then hunger would finish off what the bandits hadn't. And if the Valharadi came, they wouldn't even last a month. Daniel sat down on the threshold of the smithy next to Lyra. She didn't move away. He looked out at the village. 20 houses. Half of them damaged. A well. A stream 100 meters away. A forest beyond the hill. He began to count. Not in his head. Out loud. Muttering to himself. How many calories are needed per day for 43 people? How many roots could be gathered within an hour's walk? What would be the yield of the local grain if they plowed the field now? Would the second crop be ready before the cold set in? Lyra listened. She didn't understand half the words, but she listened. Because this voice was different. It wasn't her brother's voice, which always spoke slowly and uncertainly. This voice was counting. This voice knew numbers. This voice sounded as if something enormous and invisible stood behind it. She didn't know exactly what had changed in her brother, but she could feel it. Something had changed. On the second day, he got serious about the forge. Gorn demanded that the furnace be rebuilt. The local clay wasn't suitable for high temperatures, but he found another kind by the stream. Gray. Dense. With a high silicon content. He determined this by touch and by biting into it. 400 years of knowledge included this too. He asked Gort to give him 2 men. Gort gave him 1. A guy named Bran. Broad-shouldered. Silent. with the dull, obedient look of a man used to doing as he's told. Daniel didn't bother explaining. He demonstrated. Knead the clay like this. Lay it like this. Make the wall this thick. Bran did as he was told. Slowly, but precisely. By evening, the forge was ready. Not perfect, but it worked. Daniel lit a fire, the first fire in this forge in God knows how long. The flames were weak. There wasn't much coal. The wood was damp. But the forge was breathing. He pulled a few pieces of iron out of the pile of junk. A rusty door bolt. A fragment of a horseshoe. 2 bent nails. 3 arrowheads so dull they were only good for scratching your back. That was all the material he had. He sorted it out. He estimated the weight. He estimated the carbon content based on the color of the fracture. The local iron was junk, porous, with slag inclusions. But he knew what to do with junk iron. Repeated forging, folding, and welding. This would produce steel that was non-uniform but tough. The first thing he did with the crew wasn't work on the iron. It was taking inventory. He went through every house in the village with Bran. He counted everything. Sacks of grain, heads of cheese, bundles of dried meat, root vegetables in the cellars, tools, nails, ropes, leather, cloth. Every piece of iron was bigger than a nail. Gort followed behind them, grumbling that Mr. Velen was counting like a merchant, not a knight. Daniel didn't reply. He was counting. By evening, he had the full picture. Enough grain for 45 days at the current rate of consumption. If they cut rations to a minimum, it would last 60 days. Enough tools for 1 work crew. Enough iron for 30 small items or 1 large one. Enough firewood to keep them warm for 2 weeks. The situation was worse than he'd thought. Not critical, but close. He gathered the crew at the smithy and explained. He didn't lie. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said there wasn't enough food. That winter would come in 4 months. That if they did nothing, by the time the first snow fell, they would start dying. The 7 men listened in silence. Then Bran asked what to do. Daniel answered with 1 word. Plow. But there was nothing to plow with. The only plow in the village was wooden. Old. With an iron plowshare so worn down that it scratched the ground rather than cut through it. With that plow, 2 men could plow a strip in a day large enough to sow enough grain for a week's worth of food. Too slow. Daniel spent an hour at the plow. He took it apart, put it back together, took it apart again. The problem wasn't the design. The design was simple and, in its own way, sensible. The problem was the materials and the angles. The plowshare was set almost horizontally. It skimmed across the ground instead of cutting into it. The angle of attack was 0. It was like trying to cut bread with a knife laid flat. He reforged the plowshare. It took a whole day because the iron was poor quality and the forge wasn't yet hot enough. But he managed it. The new plowshare was set at an angle of 22 degrees. Not because it looked nice. Because at that angle, the plowshare cuts into the loam with minimal effort and maximum furrow formation. He didn't know this from books on agriculture. He knew it from calculations on stamping sheet metal. The principle was the same: angle, force, and material resistance. Then he changed the shape of the moldboard. The local plow simply pushed the soil aside. The new moldboard was curved. It turned the soil over. It brought the lower, moist layer to the surface. Daniel didn't know how to explain why this was important. He simply said that the soil needed to breathe. Bran nodded. The soil needs to breathe. Got it. On the 3rd day, the crew went out into the field with the new plow. 2 oxen pulled it, the same ones as before. The same soil. But the plow worked differently. It didn't scrape. It cut. The soil opened up behind it in a smooth, dark strip, moist, alive. On the 1st day, they plowed 3 times as much as usual. Gord stood at the edge of the field and said nothing. Then he left and returned with a jug of mash. They drank in silence. But there was something new in the silence. Not a celebration, just a sigh of relief. Just the feeling that maybe they'd live to see spring. Daniel didn't drink. He sat off to the side and drew with a stick on the ground. A water wheel. The stream behind the village had a drop of 1.5 meters over a stretch 20 paces long. That would be enough. Not for a mill. The mill could come later. First, a hammer. A water hammer that would forge for him while he slept. But that was for later. Right now, grain. Grain was a different kind of problem. Supplies were running low. The new harvest wouldn't be ready for at least 3 months, and people wanted to eat every day. He recalled what he knew about root crops. Turnips. If turnips grow here, they'll be ready to harvest in 45 days. Faster than any grain. Fewer calories, but survival isn't about comfort. He asked Martha. Martha said that wild turnips grow behind the forest. Small, bitter. No one had planted them on purpose because they were food for pigs, not for people. Daniel asked her to gather some seeds. Martha looked at him. Then she shrugged and sent 2 women to get the seeds. 3 days later, he had a handful of small seeds. He sowed 2 rows in the plowed field. Turnips between the rows of grain. Intercropping. The locals watched in bewilderment. No one had ever done that. Grain on its own. Everything else on its own. That's what their grandfathers had taught them. Daniel didn't bother explaining the nitrogen cycle or mulching. He said that turnips held water in the soil and the grain grew better. It was a simplification bordering on a lie. But he couldn't give a lecture on agronomy to people who didn't know what nitrogen was. The first week was over. The roof on the blacksmith shop was finished. Horn was working. The plow has been reforged. The field has been sown. A crew of 7 is working. The children are sleeping warmly. Ronan isn't crying at night. Theo still carries the urn with his mother's ashes. Lyra is silent but follows Daniel everywhere. Like a shadow. Like a dog afraid its master will leave. On the 8th day, the first stranger arrived. Not from the village, from the road. A man in his 30s, skinny, with an empty knapsack and the eyes of a man who'd been walking for a long time without knowing where he was going. A former soldier. His name was Kieran. He'd deserted from the Royal Army after the Battle of the River Mern, 3 months ago. Since then, he'd been walking north, away from the war. Gort wanted to send him away. A deserter is trouble. If the king's investigators found out that the village had sheltered a deserter, they'd burn the village to the ground. That's the law. Daniel looked at Kern. He saw his hands. Large, skilled. The hands of a man used to working, not just with a sword. Kern said that before joining the army, he'd been a carpenter. Daniel replied that he needed carpenters. Gort objected. Daniel listened. Then he said that if they turned away everyone who came asking for help, soon there would be no one left to help them. Gort fell silent. Kern stayed. Daniel gave him an axe. That very one. The blunt one with a chip in it. Kern looked at the axe. Then at Daniel. Then without a word, he went into the forest and by evening had hauled back 6 logs. Hewn. Smooth. Ready. The axe was a piece of junk. But Kern had golden hands. The crew grew to 8 people. On the 10th day, Daniel did something that changed everything. Not a plow. Not a knife. He sat down with Lyra on the threshold of the smithy and began to draw. With a stick on the ground. He was drawing a blueprint. A simple one. The roof of a new house for the children. Beams, rafters, corners. He drew and explained. Here's the load. Here's the support. If heavy snow falls, the pressure will shift here. So we need a brace here. Lyra listened. Her eyes were fixed on him. Then she asked why the support is needed right here and not there. Daniel paused. He looked at her. She was 12 years old. She had just asked the right question. Not a clever question. The right one. She had seen the force vector without knowing what it was. Intuitively. From the drawing. He answered. He explained it using the weight of a sack on a stick. If you hold the stick by the end, it's heavy. If you hold it closer to the middle, it's lighter. Where the prop is placed is like where you hold the stick. Lyra nodded. Then she took the stick from his hands and adjusted the drawing. She moved the prop. 3 fingers to the left. Daniel looked. She was right. Not just roughly. Exactly. At that point, the moment of force is minimal. He said nothing. But something stirred inside him. Not joy. Something more. Recognition. He'd seen students like this at the factory. 1 in 1,000. Who don't learn formulas but see how the world works. He went to the blacksmith shop. 3 hours. When he came out, he was holding a bundle of oiled leather. Inside were 4 items. A ruler made from a smooth birch block with notches at equal intervals. A compass made from 2 iron rods fastened together with a rivet. A chisel. And a thin stylus for drawing on clay tablets. Small ones. Just right for her hand. Just right for her fingers. He handed the bundle to Lyra. She unwrapped it. She looked at each item. She picked up the compass. She opened it, held it against the ground, drew a circle, a perfect one. She looked up at Daniel, and for the first time in God knows how long, she smiled. She didn't laugh. She didn't beam. Just the corners of her lips twitched upward. For a single second. But Daniel saw it, and that second was enough. That evening, Lyra sat by the fire and drew on a clay tablet. Theo snuggled up to her and watched. Ronan slept on Martha's lap. Kieran was planing logs by the wall. Bran was sharpening a sickle. Gort smoked his pipe and gazed at the sky. Daniel sat by the forge and did his calculations. Dozens of tasks swirled through his mind. The water wheel, the walls, supplies, weapons, defense, winter, enemies, the Valharats, war, the guild, the law. Each problem led to 10 others, an endless chain. But he was an engineer, and an engineer doesn't solve all problems at once. An engineer finds the critical path, the weakest link, the bottleneck, solves it, then the next one, then the next. The critical path right now is food. Solve the food problem, and everything else will fall into place. Fail to solve it, and nothing else will matter. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the water wheel. No. First, survey the stream. Take measurements. Then the design. Then construction. 3 weeks at least. If Kern is as good with wood as he seems, then maybe 2. He fell asleep right by the forge. Lyra covered him with a blanket, the same one she used to cover the real Dane. She stood over him and watched. Her brother was asleep. But he breathed differently. He moved differently. He spoke differently. He was counting. Dane had never counted before. Before, Dane would sit in the corner, sharpening his sword, silent, and sometimes smile at her guiltily, as if apologizing for not being able to change anything. This Dane wasn't apologizing. This Dane was changing things. Lyra didn't know the word for what she was feeling. She was afraid. Not of him. For him. Because whoever changes the world usually has the world break in return. She smoothed out the blanket and went to sleep. The 14th day. Daniel stood knee-deep in the stream and measured the depth with a notched stick. The water was freezing. His feet were going numb, but he kept measuring. Width, depth, flow rate, elevation drop. He calculated the water flow rate in his head, liters per second. Then he converted it to potential power. Then to usable power, accounting for friction losses and design inefficiencies. The result was small, but it was enough. For a small overshot wheel with a diameter of 2 meters, the power would be sufficient to drive a cam-operated hammer weighing 15 kilograms. It's not a steam hammer. It's not a hydraulic press. It's primitive. But this primitive contraption will forge non-stop, day and night. It will produce in a single day what Daniel does at the anvil in a week. He returned to the village wet and blue with cold. Martha gave him a bowl of hot soup and a woolen shawl to drape over his shoulders. He sipped the soup and sketched a diagram of the water wheel on a clay tablet. Kern looked over his shoulder. He asked what it was. Daniel explained. Water turns the wheel. The wheel turns the shaft. There are cams on the shaft. The cams lift the hammer. The hammer falls. It strikes. It rises again. It strikes. No hands. No fatigue. Kern watched for a long time. Then he said he needed wood. Oak. Lots of oak. The axle must be made from a single log or it will break. Daniel looked at Kern. Kern had just identified the project's main engineering problem himself. The load-bearing axle. The point of maximum load. A carpenter who thinks like an engineer. The second one in 2 weeks. Maybe this world wasn't as hopeless as it seemed. They began building the water wheel on the 16th day. Kern was felling oak trees. Bran and 2 others were hauling logs. Daniel was marking out and shaping the parts. Lyra was drawing the blueprints as he dictated them. Her small hand traced lines on the clay, steady and confident. The work progressed slowly, not because people were lazy, because the tools were terrible. Every axe would dull within an hour. Every saw would jam. Every nail had to be forged by hand, and every third one bent when hammered in. Daniel gritted his teeth. The wheel spun for 3 days without a break, and on the third night, the left bearing seized up. Daniel heard the grinding noise from his bed. He ran barefoot to the stream. In the darkness, he felt his way around. He found the problem. The wood had overheated from friction and swelled. He took the bearing apart, pulled out the bushing, planed it down by 0.5 millimeter, greased it, put it back in. The wheel started turning again. But he stood there in the dark, thinking. Wooden bearings were a dead end. In a month, they'd seize up again, and the month after that. And every time, he'd have to run out here at night and fiddle with them in the dark. He needed a different material. Bronze. Or at least copper-tin alloy. There was neither in the village. He returned to the blacksmith shop and sat by the extinguished forge. He thought, copper. Where to get copper? He had no money to buy it, nothing to trade for it. Stealing wasn't an option, so he had to find it. He remembered what he'd seen in the stream, green spots on the rocks downstream. He hadn't paid any attention to them then. Now he did. The green patina on the rocks in the stream was copper oxide. That meant that somewhere further upstream, the water was flowing through rock containing copper. Not ore. Most likely placer deposits, small ones. But if he collected them for a long time and with patience. In the morning, he sent Bran and 2 men upstream to look for green stones, to bring back everything they found. Bran returned in the evening with a sack. The stones were small, greenish, veined. Daniel split one open. Something glinted dimly inside. Malachite, copper carbonate. The metal content is low, 5 or maybe 10%. But from a kilogram of rock, you can get 50 grams of copper. There might be 300 grams in the sack. That's enough for 2 bearings. He spent 2 days smelting it. You need a different furnace for copper. The melting point is 1,080 degrees. His furnace could reach maybe 900. Maybe. He found a solution. Bellows. He needed bellows. There were some old ones in the smithy, but they were torn. He repaired them. Leather, wood, a valve made of thin leather on a wooden frame. Primitive. But when Bran pumped the bellows steadily and strongly, the temperature in the furnace jumped by 200 degrees. That was enough. The first smelting was a disaster. Half the copper went into the slag. Daniel cursed in Korean. Bran asked what it meant. Daniel said it was a prayer in his mother's language. Bran nodded. The second smelting yielded a piece of copper the size of a fist. Dirty, full of bubbles. But copper. Real copper. He forged 2 bearing inserts from it. Not perfect, but 10 times better than the wooden ones. He installed them. The wheel spun more smoothly, quieter, faster. The bearings would last half a year, maybe longer. Now for the hammer. He'd been designing it in his head for 2 days. Then he drew it on a clay tablet. Then he showed it to Lyra. He explained the principle. The shaft rotates. A cam is attached to the shaft, a protrusion. When the shaft turns, the cam catches the hammer's tail and lifts it. When the cam moves past, the hammer falls. A blow. Then it rises again. Another blow. Rhythm. Constant. Tireless. Lyra drew along with him. She asked once more. Why was the cam shaped exactly like that? Daniel explained. If it's round, the hammer rises and falls smoothly. If it's sharp, it jerks. A jerk breaks the axle. Smoothness preserves it. Lyra nodded and finished drawing the cam. With the correct shape. Without prompting. Building the hammer took 10 days. The main problem wasn't the mechanics. The mechanics were simple. The main problem was the foundation. The hammer strikes. The blow goes into the ground. If the ground is soft, within a week the hammer will sink knee-deep into the soil. A stone slab is needed. There was no stone in the village. Daniel sent Kern and 4 men to a rocky outcrop beyond the forest. For 2 days they chiseled out the slab. They hauled it on rollers made of logs and set it in place. The slab weighed so much that Daniel was genuinely afraid it would sink into the ground even without the hammer. It didn't. The soil by the stream was dense, clay mixed with stones. It held. The water hammer's first blow rang out on the 32nd day, a dull, heavy, rhythmic. Once every 3 seconds. Thud. 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 It sounded like a heartbeat. Daniel placed a piece of iron on the anvil beneath the hammer, a rusty fragment of a door hinge. The hammer struck. The iron flattened. Another blow, then another. In a minute, the hammer did the work that would have taken half an hour by hand. Daniel stood and watched, and he couldn't hold back a smile, a crooked one. Worn out, but genuine. He's an engineer. He built his first machine in this world. Out of mud, out of wood, out of scrap iron and copper stolen from the stream. But the machine worked, and it would work tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a month from now. And he didn't care who the king was, what the laws were, or what the church thought about good tools. He'd just keep hammering. Thud. 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 The forge's output had increased. Not 6-fold as he'd expected. 4-fold. Losses in the transmission. Design flaws. Play in the joints. But 4-fold is still a revolution. Now he could forge nails by the hundreds. Now he could make tooltips faster than they broke. Now he had time. Not much, but time. And he used it. On the 35th day, a girl came to the village, tall, red-headed, with hands bigger than half the men in the work brigade. She stood by the forge and looked at the water hammer. For a long time. Then she turned to Daniel and said she wanted to work there. Her name was Hannah Reed. She was the daughter of a miller from the village beyond the forest. Her father had died under the millstone 2 years ago. The mechanism had jammed. The millstone had come loose. Her father was found trapped beneath it. Her mother had died even earlier. Hannah lived alone. She worked for strangers in exchange for food. She did laundry. She carried water. She chopped wood. Work for hands that were meant for something else. She'd heard that in Homeguard, a young gentleman was building strange things, that water turned a wheel, and the wheel struck a hammer. She came to see for herself. And when she saw it, she knew she wanted to be here. Gord said that a woman at the anvil was a bad omen. Daniel looked at Gord, then at Hannah, then at the anvil. He said a superstition is when a black cat crosses your path. But when a person wants to work, that's not a superstition, it's a gift. Gord muttered something and walked away. Hannah became the 9th member of the crew. The first thing Daniel did was put her in charge of the bellows. Not at the anvil, at the bellows. It was a test, and they both knew it. Pumping the bellows is hard, monotonous, boring. It's the kind of work no one wants to do. Hannah pumped the bellows for 3 days, without a single complaint. Rhythmically, steadily, exactly as it should be. On the 4th day, Daniel put her at the anvil. He handed her a hammer, an ordinary hand hammer. Too heavy for her. She was holding it wrong, too close to the head. The swing came from her shoulder instead of her torso. Inefficient. He corrected her, showed her. Like this. Grip lower, swing from the hip. The hammer's weight does the work. You don't need to strike, you need to guide it. Just like with Martha's cleaver. Same principle. Hannah tried it. The first blow missed, the second went askew, the third hit the mark, and the fourth, and the fifth. An hour later she was forging evenly. Not fast, not pretty, but even. The metal obeyed her. She could feel it. The second month began with rain. It poured non-stop for 3 days. The stream swelled, and the water wheel spun so fast that Daniel feared for the axle. He made a damper on the flume to regulate the flow, just a simple board on a hinge. But it solved the problem. Now the wheel worked in any weather. The rain drove everyone indoors. Work came to a standstill. Daniel used the brake to his advantage. He sat down in the smithy and sketched. He didn't come out for 3 days. Lyra brought him food. He ate without looking up. He drew. He redrew. He calculated. 3 projects. A mill driven by a water wheel, a brick kiln, and a crossbow. He decided to tackle the mill first. No need to build a separate wheel. He needed a second drive shaft from the same shaft. A gear. A wooden one that transmits rotation to the millstone. They already had a millstone. The very one under which Hannah's father had died. Hannah dragged it over 2 days later. Alone. Dragging it. through the forest. When Daniel asked why she hadn't asked for help, Hannah replied that this millstone had killed her father, and she wanted to drag it here herself, so that it would work for the living. Daniel said nothing. The millstone was heavy, granite, with the right grooves, a good millstone. Hannah's father knew his craft. He installed it in 4 days. Kern carved the gear. Roughly, the teeth were uneven, but it turned. The millstone was up and running. The first batch of flour was gray and coarse, but it was flour, their own, not bought, not traded for, made right here from their own grain on their own mill. Martha baked the first loaf of bread. She handed out a piece to everyone. Hot, heavy, with a crispy crust. Half the village ate in silence. Not because the bread was special, but because it was the first in a long time. A brick kiln became the second project. There was plenty of clay around. The issue was the temperature. Good bricks require 900 degrees. A regular bonfire reaches 400. They needed a chamber kiln with forced draft. He built it in a week, a pit in the hillside, lined with stones. On top, a vault made of sun-dried clay. A chimney made of old pots stacked one on top of the other and coated with clay. The draft came from below through a channel in the floor. No bellows. Natural draft created by the temperature difference. Hot air rises. Cold air is drawn in from below. Physics. The first batch of bricks came out warped. Half of them cracked. A quarter crumbled. But a quarter survived. 200 bricks. Solid. Even. Red. He tapped one with his knuckles. A ringing sound. High-pitched. Clear. Good bricks. The second batch was better. The third even better. By the end of the second month, he had 800 bricks. Enough for one wall of a house. Or for one heating stove. He chose the stove. A house can be insulated with clay and mush. But you can't get heat in winter out of thin air. He built the first brick stove in the house where the children lived. A Russian stove. No, he couldn't call it that. Just a stove. With a bench. With a chimney. With a chamber that retains heat for 10 hours after the firewood has burned out. The heat capacity of brick. The simplest principle. But no one built that way here. Here they heated with fireplaces. An open fire. 90% of the heat went up the chimney. 10% for heating. His stove did the opposite. The first night with the new stove, Daniel went in to check on the children. Ronan was sleeping on the bench. Warm. His cheeks were rosy. His mouth was slightly open. His fingers had unclenched for the first time in ages. Usually he slept curled up, fists clenched, like a little animal ready to run. But now he was stretched out, relaxed, warm, safe. Theo was lying next to him. The urn containing his mother's ashes stood on the shelf above his head, not in his hands, on the shelf. She had let him go, not his mother, the urn, the first step. Lyra sat by the stove, drawing a sketch by the light of the fire. She looked up when Daniel entered, and said nothing. And there was no need to say anything. The crossbow, the third project, the most difficult one. Not because a crossbow is a complex design. The design is simple. The stock, the limbs, the bowstring, the trigger mechanism. Simple. If you have the right materials and precise tools. He had neither. The crossbow's limbs are its heart. They must be resilient, strong, capable of bending 1,000 times without breaking. He could have made steel limbs, but the quality of the local steel wouldn't allow it. Too brittle after hardening, too soft without hardening. There was no middle ground. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he remembered. A composite. Not carbon fiber. Wood and tendons. You sapwood on the back. You heartwood on the belly. A layer of tendons on top. Hoof glue. It's a 1,000-year-old technique. The Mongols made their bows that way. He could replicate it. There was yew in the forest. Kern found 3 trees. He took the tendons from old ox hides. He boiled the hoof glue for 2 days. The stench was so bad that Martha threatened to kick him out of the village. The first limbs dried for a week. He checked them. He bent them. Slowly. To the working angle. They creaked but held. They straightened out smoothly. Springy. He bent them again. And again. 20 times. Not a single crack. The stock was made of birch. Straight. Simple. With a groove for the bolt. The trigger mechanism was just like the one he had at home. Literally. A lever. A catch. A spring. The same principles as in an industrial press, only on a different scale. He made the trigger mechanism from 2 iron plates and a single pin. 3 parts. The bowstring hooked onto a lug. His finger pressed the lever. The lug dropped. The bowstring released. The bolt flew. Cleanly, precisely, without a jerk. He fired his first shot on the 53rd day. Morning. Quiet. The crossbow lay heavy and unfamiliar in his hands. He drew the bowstring with his thumb. The windlass was also his own design, toothed, with a ratchet, so that even weak hands could pull it back. He loaded the bolt. He aimed at a stump 30 paces away. He pulled the trigger. A click. A whistle. An impact. The bolt sank 2 fingers deep into the stump. Daniel walked over. He tried to pull it out. He couldn't. He had to wiggle it. He turned around. The crew was standing behind him, and Hannah, and Kern, and Gort. Everyone was looking at the stump, then at him. Gort asked how many of these he could make. Daniel said he'd made 1 in a week, but if Hannah forged the parts, Kern made the stocks, and Bran glued the shoulders, then 4 a week. Gort nodded. 4 a week. 32 crossbows in 2 months. Daniel corrected him. 30. 2 would be rejects, and they'd need 20 bolts for each one. All the same. Standard. So that any bolt would fit any crossbow. Gort didn't understand why they had to be identical. Daniel explained. If you have 10 crossbows and each has its own bolts, then in battle you can't pass a bolt to your neighbor. If the bolts are identical, then you can. Gort thought about it. Then he said that was very clever for a blacksmith. Daniel didn't bother to clarify that he wasn't a blacksmith. He started production. Hannah forged the arrowheads, all identical, following a template, 20 a day. Kern cut the stocks. Bran glued the shoulders. Daniel made the trigger mechanisms and assembled the finished crossbows. Lyra kept track of everything. How many were made? How many were in progress? How much material was left? Her clay tablets were the first production control system in this world. She didn't know that was what it was called. She just wrote down the numbers. On the 58th day, a rider approached the village. Alone. On a fine horse. In clean clothes. With a coat of arms on his chest. A guild inspector. He had come because rumors had reached the guild. The village of Holmgard on the northern outskirts. Some young nobleman was forging iron. Without a license. Without a hallmark. Without a permit. The inspector's name was Foss. Slender, with a neat little beard, with the cold eyes of a man accustomed to being feared. He at the smithy. He looked at the water wheel, at the hammer, at the brick furnace, at Hannah, who was standing by the anvil with a hammer in her hand, at a row of finished crossbow stocks against the wall. Then he looked at Daniel. He said that according to the bylaws of the Great Guild of Aldrin Blacksmiths, anyone who forges iron without the guild's hallmark is subject to arrest. Their property is subject to confiscation. And if it is discovered that a master has been training apprentices without a license, his right hand will be branded with a red-hot iron. Daniel listened. Silently. His face was calm. Inside, things were not so calm. Foss asked if he had a guild brand. Daniel replied that he did not. Foss asked if he understood the consequences. Daniel replied that he did. Foss pulled out a scroll, a confiscation order, the guild's seal. After Foss left, Daniel didn't sleep for 2 days. Not because he was afraid, because he was doing the math. 30 crossbows in 2 months, that's 15 a month. 3 a week, accounting for defects. The shoulders take 7 days to dry. That means he needs to make extra shoulders. 10 sets are drying while 5 are being assembled. An assembly line. He didn't call it that out loud. He told Hannah that the work had to flow continuously. 1 part here, another there. A 3rd is drying. A 4th is being assembled. No one waits. Everyone is busy. Hannah nodded. She understood this intuitively, just as any sensible worker understands that downtime is a loss. But crossbows aren't everything. Daniel knew that 30 crossbows without people who know how to shoot them are just 10 expensive sticks. Archers are needed. He gathered the village, all 46 people. 3 newcomers had arrived in recent weeks. 1 family from the west, a husband, wife and daughter. They had fled the war. Daniel took them in without question. He explained the situation. The guild is a threat. The Valharati will come sooner or later. Baron Hosk in the east is collecting taxes from villages that cannot resist. They are on their own. There will be no help. The king has no time for them. The nobles have no time for them. The gods, if they exist, have no time for them either. He didn't make grand speeches. He spoke in numbers. How many men Hask can field? How many soldiers are in the Valharat raid? How many crossbows he could make? How many days it would take to prepare? And what was required of each person? Gort listened and said nothing. The women listened and said nothing. The men listened and said nothing. Then Bran stood up, tall, quiet. He said that before the young lord arrived, they had eaten roots, but now they ate bread. Before the young master arrived, they slept in the cold, but now the children have a warm stove. He said that if the master says they need to shoot, then he will shoot. He sat down. Silence. Then Hannah stood up. She didn't speak. She picked up a crossbow. She showed it to everyone. She put it back down. Then Kern stood up. He said he was a deserter, that he had fled the war. But here he wouldn't run away because there was something worth fighting for here. 14 people volunteered for the militia. 9 men, 5 women. 3 of them had never held anything heavier than a hoe. Daniel began training the next day. He knew nothing about military training. He was an engineer, not a sergeant. But he knew something else. He knew ergonomics. He knew that if a person stands incorrectly, they'll get tired in a minute, but if they stand correctly, they can last an hour. He knew that aiming isn't about the eye, it's about body position. He knew that calisthenics isn't about strength, it's about the sequence of movements. And he knew the most important thing, that any complex action can be broken down into simple steps. The crossbow. Step 1. Rest the stock against your shoulder. Step 2. Place your foot in the stirrup. Step 3. Hook the bow. Step 4. Turn the handle. Step 5. Load the bolt. Step 6. Aim. Step 7. Breathe. Step 8. Pull the trigger as you exhale. 8 steps, each one separately, each one until it becomes second nature, then all together. He trained them just as he trained the workers at the factory, first slowly, then faster, then with their eyes closed. After 2 weeks, his best shooter could reload in 20 seconds, the worst in 40. He set a goal, everyone in 30 seconds or less, by the end of the month. On the 65th day, Daniel set out for Crow's Meadow, a village half a day's journey to the east. He walked with Kern and Bran. He carried 2 items with him, a plow, an improved one, just like his own, but with a few modifications. The plowshare was slightly narrower for the rocky soil found in those parts. And a cleaver, an ordinary one, but with a curved handle, just like the one for Martha. Crow's Meadow was smaller than Halmgard. 30 people, hungry, frightened, led by an old man, Elder Cole, stooped, coughing, suspicious. He didn't want to talk. He'd seen nobles before. They'd come and take things. Always. Daniel didn't bother to explain. He set the plow down by the well. He placed the cutlass beside it. He sat down on the ground, and he said it was a gift. Not a sale, not a trade, a gift. Cole didn't believe him. He asked what he wanted in return. Daniel replied that he needed a blacksmith. He'd heard there was a blacksmith in Crow's Meadow, an old one, who hardly worked anymore because the guild had taken away his brand 10 years ago for selling knives below the set price. Since then, he's been forbidden to touch an anvil. The blacksmith's name was Alvin. 60 years old, skinny as a rake, hands covered in scars, eyes clouded by the cheap beer he'd been drowning 10 years of nonsense in. When Daniel found him, Alvin was sitting behind the barn, drinking. Daniel sat down next to him. He paused. Then he said he needed help, that he was building a smithy in Holmgard, that he needed someone who knew the local iron, who knew which clay was best for the forge, who knew where to look for ore in these hills. Daniel said he knew a lot, but he knew other things. And local knowledge was something he didn't have, and couldn't be learned from books. Olven looked at him for a long time. His cloudy eyes grew a little clearer. He asked if Daniel was afraid of the guild. Daniel replied that he was afraid, but he's doing it anyway. Olven grunted. Then he asked what he'd get in return. Daniel replied that he'd get an anvil, a new one, and the right to forge whatever he wanted for whomever he wanted, without a hallmark and without a permit. As long as he's alive, no inspector will take Olven's hammer away. Olven was silent. Then he finished his mug. He stood up. He staggered. He straightened up. He said he needed a day to pack his things. Daniel nodded. A day later, Alvin arrived at Homeguard, sober, with a bag of tools he'd been hiding for 10 years. Among them were a pair of tongs of a quality Daniel had never seen before. Handcrafted. Perfect. Olven said this was his last piece of work. He'd made it before the guild took away his mark. Daniel looked at the pliers, then at Olven. He said this wasn't his last piece of work. It was his first. Olven became the 11th member of the crew, and he brought more than just his hands. He brought knowledge. Local. Practical. Priceless. He knew there was a deposit of brown iron ore in the hills to the north. Not deep. Near surface. The guild knew about it but hadn't minded because the ore was low grade. 2% iron. Not worth the effort by guild standards. Daniel looked at Alvin and smiled. 2% was too little for the guild. For him, it was enough. If he had the ore, he wouldn't need to buy iron. No need to trade. No need to ask. His own source. His own metal. Freedom. He sent Bran with 3 men to the deposit. They returned 2 days later with a cartload of ore. Daniel built a simple smelting furnace. A pit in the ground lined with stones. A layer of coal. A layer of ore. A layer of coal. Set it alight. Pump the bellows for 12 hours. At the bottom lay the bloom. Spongy iron saturated with slag. Rubbish by any normal metallurgist's standards. But he knew what to do with the bloom. Repeated forging. Under a water hammer. Layering. Welding. Forging. Again. And again. Each cycle drives out the slag. Each cycle compacts the metal. After 6 cycles, the result is steel. Not bulat. Not Damascus. Utility steel. Hard enough for a blade. Tough enough not to break. Enough for everything he needs. The first ingot of his own steel landed on the anvil on the 73rd day. Hannah struck it with a hammer. The metal responded. A clear ring. Not the dull thud of shoddy iron. A ring. Olven listened. Then he picked up a piece. He looked at the fracture, ran his fingernail along it, raised his eyebrows. Said it was good steel. Not excellent, but good. Better than what the guild sells to the villages for triple the price. Daniel nodded. It was the beginning. Not a revolution. Revolution. That word was too grand for a blacksmith shop with a leaky roof in a village at the edge of the world. But it was the beginning of something. Something that mattered. On the 75th day, 3 horsemen rode up to the village. Not from the guild. Not from the king's men. Strangers. In dark cloaks. On fine horses. They asked for directions to the pass. Daniel pointed the way. They rode off. But he saw one of them looking at the water wheel. For a long time. Intently. With professional interest. And he saw that beneath their cloaks, each of them wore chainmail. Scouts. He didn't know whose. Baron Hask. The guild. The Valharadi. Someone else. But scouts. They'd found him. He stood there watching them ride away. Then he turned to Maeve. He didn't know when she'd appeared. She was standing behind him. Silent, with a crossbow in her hands, limping on her right leg. A former royal archer. Discharged after being wounded in the thigh. She had arrived in Homeguard 3 days ago. She didn't say where she was from. She didn't say why. She just came. She stood at the gate. She looked at the village. And she stayed. Daniel didn't ask. He saw how she moved. Economical. Precise. Every movement calculated. A soldier. An officer. Someone used to giving orders. Used to killing. And used to the fact that the world is a place where you can be stabbed in the back at any moment. She looked at the horsemen. Then at him. She said they were scouts. Daniel said he knew. Maeve asked how many men he had. He said 14 in the militia. Maeve asked how many of them had killed. He said 1. Kern. Maeve was silent for a moment. Then she said that 14 with crossbows in a good position were equal to 40 with swords. If the position is right, Daniel looked at her. Then he asked if she knew what a right position was. Maeve almost smiled, with one corner of her mouth. She said that was the only thing she knew well. Daniel nodded, and he offered her the chance to lead the militia. Maeve didn't answer right away. She looked at the crossbow in her hands, then at her leg, her right hip. It wouldn't bend all the way. She was limping. She couldn't run. She couldn't kneel. She couldn't do what she used to do. The army had written her off, thrown her away like a broken tool. She uttered the word, broken, as if she were biting it off with her teeth. Daniel said nothing. He went into the smithy. 2 days later he came out. In his hands was a crossbow. Not like the others. This one was custom-made for Maeve. The stock was longer, with a cutout for her right hip. It rested against her torso rather than her shoulder, so she could shoot while standing with her weight shifted to her left leg. The cocking mechanism had an extended handle so she could turn it with one hand while the other maintained her balance. He handed the crossbow to Maeve. She took it, raised it. She pressed it against her body. She took aim. Her body found the right position instantly. Not a single unnecessary movement. The crossbow fit her like a glove. She fired. The bolt struck the target 50 paces away, right in the center. She reloaded, fired. Center. Again. And again. 4 shots, 4 hits. Faster than any of his militiamen. Faster than he was himself. She lowered the crossbow. She stood in silence. Daniel could see that the knuckles on her fingers had turned white. That's how tightly she was gripping the weapon. She turned toward him. She held out her hand. He shook it. Her hand was firm, dry, strong. She said one word. Agreed. From that day on, Maeve became the militia commander, and Daniel got what he'd been missing most of all. Not a marksman, not an officer. A person who looks at the world and sees danger. Who knows where the attack will come from. Who doesn't sleep at night because they're listening. A shield. She became his shield. Within a week, Maeve had overhauled the entire defense system. Not walls and moats. Positions. Firing positions. Retreat routes. Signals. She stationed lookouts on the 3 hills surrounding the village, 2 on each hill, equipped with whistles Daniel had made from tin. 2 short whistles meant cavalry. 3 long whistles meant infantry. 1 long continuous whistle meant run. She trained the militia more rigorously than Daniel did. Not cruelly, rigorously. The difference is that cruelty is pointless, while rigor saves lives. She made them shoot in the rain. Shoot when they were tired. Shoot after running. Shoot after being woken up in the middle of the night by a scream. Because the enemy won't come when it's convenient. The enemy comes when it's inconvenient. Daniel watched. He learned. He didn't know war, but he knew people. And he saw that Maeve was doing with the militia what he had done with the brigade. She made it clear to everyone that they were needed. That their place in the ranks was their place. That they weren't cannon fodder thrown into the line because there was no one else left. They were defenders. Of their children, of their bread, of their workshops. The 80th day. 3 months in the New World. Daniel stood on a hill above the village and looked down. Holmgard had changed. The blacksmith shop was in operation. The water hammer pounded rhythmically. 2 months is a long time when you're building a house. And a mere drop in the bucket when you're preparing for war. Daniel divided the work into 2 streams. The first, defense. The second, production. They couldn't put one on hold for the other. People need to eat while they prepare to die. Maeve drew up a defense plan in 3 days. She surveyed every hill, every ravine, every trail. She looked at the terrain the way Daniel looked at a mechanism. She saw the weak spots. She saw where they could be reinforced. She saw where the enemy would go and where they wouldn't. The main position was the bridge over the stream, the only passage for cavalry and wagons. On both sides lay marshy floodplains. On foot, it's possible to go around, but slowly and knee-deep in mud. So, the bridge. Maeve said the bridge needed to be fortified. Not so the enemy could cross it, but so the enemy couldn't cross it. Barricades, traps made of sharpened stakes, an earthen rampart in front of the bridge with loopholes for crossbowmen, and a retreat route. If the position falls, the archers retreat along the trail to the mill. The mill is the second position. Stone walls, narrow windows, a good view for 100 paces in every direction. Daniel listened and nodded. He didn't understand the tactics, but he understood the engineering of fortifications. An earthen rampart is an embankment with a slope angle of 45 degrees. If it's too flat, it's easy to climb. If it's steeper, it crumbles. 45 degrees is optimal. He knew this from his calculations for foundations. A different world. Same physics. They began to build. The whole village. Everyone who could hold a shovel. The women dug. The men hauled logs. The children carried stones. Lyra kept track how much earth had been dug out, how many stakes had been driven in, how many days remained. Her notepads turned into a real project log. Daniel watched them and thought that in Seoul, she would have been admitted to the best technical university without even taking an entrance exam. At the same time, he was working on weapons. Crossbows were good for open-field combat, but if the enemy got close, a crossbow was useless. It took 20 seconds to reload. In 20 seconds, a man with a sword could run 40 paces. He needed something for close combat, not swords. His peasants didn't know how to wield swords, and they wouldn't learn in 2 months. He needed something simple, something that would work in the hands of a man who had been holding a hoe just yesterday. He came up with a pike. Not a spear, a pike. A long pole. 2.5 meters. At the end, a fork with 2 iron prongs. A crossbar between the prongs. Here's how it works. You plant the base of the pike in the ground. Lean forward. The enemy runs at you. He runs into it. The crossbar keeps the pike from going in too deep and getting stuck. Pull it out. Stab again. No strength required. No skill required. All you have to do is stand your ground and not run. Maeve looked at the pike. She turned it over in her hands. She jabbed it into a sandbag. She nodded. She said it wouldn't stop a knight in armor. Daniel replied that the Valharati didn't have knights. They had infantry. Light. Fast. In leather armor. The halberd works against them. Maeve agreed. He forged 40 sets of halberd heads in 2 weeks. The water hammer did the bulk of the work. Hannah finished them off. Olven tempered them. Kern mounted them on poles. Lyra counted the finished ones. An assembly line. 68 days until the enemy's expected arrival. Daniel set to work on something he'd been thinking about for a long time. Black powder. He knew the formula. Saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur in a ratio of 75 to 15 to 10. Every school child in his world knew this, but knowing the formula and actually making gunpowder were 2 different things. Sulfur. Where to get sulfur? Alvin had a suggestion. The hot springs. 2 hours north. There was a yellow coating on the rocks there. The locals considered it poisonous. And they were right. Sulfur dioxide is no gift. Daniel sent Bran with 3 men. They returned with 2 sacks of yellow powder. One of them was sick for 2 days. Daniel felt guilty. But he got the sulfur. Saltpeter. More complicated. He knew that saltpeter forms in places where organic matter rots when exposed to air. Cesspools. Barns. Compost piles. That white on the walls of old sheds. He went around all the sheds, scraped off the deposits with a knife, collected them, dissolved them in water. He filtered it through ash. He boiled it down. He ended up with a handful of crystals. He tasted it on his tongue. Bitter. It made his tongue go numb. Saltpeter, but not enough. Very little. He set up 3 saltpeter pits, pits layered with manure and straw. In 3 months, they'll yield saltpeter. A lot. But in 3 months, it'll be too late. The enemy will be here first. He worked with what he had. The first batch of gunpowder was laughable. 2 handfuls. He mixed it, ground it in a mortar, carefully, very carefully. 1 spark and the mortar would become his grave. He poured a pinch onto a stone. He held a smoldering splinter close. A flash. Smoke. A pop. Bran jumped back 3 steps. Daniel stood and stared at the black spot on the stone. It works. Weak. Dirty. Burning slowly. But it works. He couldn't make a cannon. He had nothing to make it with. Not enough gunpowder. Not enough metal. Not enough time. But he could make something else. Mines. A pot. A clay one, filled with gunpowder and scraps of iron. Nails, scrap metal, anything sharp. A fuse made of rope soaked in saltpeter. Bury it in the ground along the trail. Light the fuse at the right moment. Not a bomb. Not a grenade. A trap. Dirty. Underhanded. Effective. He made 8 of them. All his saltpeter went into this. There's none left. Maeve set them up along the approaches. She marked them with stones so her own people wouldn't step on them. She briefed the lookouts. Light the fuses only on command. Only when the enemy is in range. 53rd day before their arrival. A messenger arrived from Crowmead. A boy of about 14. Barefoot, out of breath. He said Baron Hask had sent tax collectors, 10 men, with swords. They took half the grain and 2 goats, and said more were coming. Village headman Cole is asking for help. Daniel sat and listened. Maeve stood beside him, silent. He could tell she was thinking the same thing he was. If they helped Crow's Meadow, they'd spread themselves too thin. If they didn't help, they'd lose their only ally. He stood up. He told Maeve to gather 10 archers. Maeve asked why 10 if there were 10 harvesters. Daniel replied that he wasn't going to shoot, he was going to talk. But it's better to talk when you have 10 men with crossbows standing behind you. They set out in the morning. 10 archers, Daniel, Maeve, Kieran. They arrived at Crowmead around noon. Hask's gatherers were already gone. They'd left with the loot. Cole met them at the well. Old, crushed. He said they'd taken everything. Not half, everything. The messenger had lied so that Daniel would come faster. Daniel looked at Cole, at the people behind him. Hungry faces, frightened eyes. He'd seen this before, in his village, 3 months ago. He told Cole he'd share the grain. Maeve flinched. It was a dangerous promise. Their supplies weren't endless. Daniel knew that. But he knew something else too. If Crow's Mead died of starvation, Holmgard would be left alone. Alone against everyone. He told Cole he'd give them the grain, but not for nothing. He needed people. 5 people who would go to Holmgard and work. To build. To learn. And in a month, they'd return and build their own forge in Crow's Mead. Their own plow. Their own mill. Cole was silent. Then he asked what would happen when Husk returned. Daniel replied that when Husk returned, there would be men with crossbows standing in Crow's Mead, just like the ones in Holmgard, and Husk would think twice before entering. Cole looked at the crossbows behind Daniel's back, at the men holding them. Peasants, ordinary peasants. But they stood tall. They looked calm. They held their weapons with confidence. 3 months ago, they had been just like the people of Crow's Mead. Hungry, frightened, crushed. Not anymore. Cole nodded. The next day, 5 men from Crow Mead arrived in Holmgard. Among them was a young man of about 20, slender, with quick hands. His name was Eric. He wasn't a blacksmith. He was a thief. A pickpocket from the city who had fled north after getting caught for the 3rd time. In the city, they chop off your hand for a 3rd theft. He fled. He ended up in Crow's Meadow. He worked for food. He wasn't very good at it. His hands were nimble, but not for a shovel. Daniel put him to work on the trigger mechanisms. Fine, precise work. Fitting parts together. Pins, springs, latches. Eric completed his first trigger assembly in 2 hours. Daniel usually took 4. The thief's hands turned out to be those of a watchmaker. Daniel looked at him and said that from now on, he was no longer a thief. He's a mechanic. Eric didn't understand the word, but he understood the meaning. 42 days until the arrival. Daniel stood in the smithy and stared at the wall. Blueprints hung on the wall. 23 clay tablets, a crossbow, a halberd, a mine, a plow, a mill, a furnace, a water wheel, a hammer. Each blueprint was signed by Lyra's hand. Number, date, number of units produced. 30 days until their arrival. The rumors had become more specific. A merchant passing through Holmgard on his way north reported seeing a Valharat column 4 days' journey to the south. 200 infantrymen, 24 cavalrymen, a supply train, and 1 man in black who wasn't riding but was walking at the head of the column, and the grass turned black beneath his footsteps. An ash mage. Daniel knew little about the magic of this world. Dane's foreign memory provided only fragments. Ash mages are Valharat's battle mages. They burn. Not with fire, with something else. They drain life from objects. Wood crumbles to dust. Metal rusts in seconds. Living flesh dries up and cracks. The radius of effect is 10 paces, maybe more. Walls are useless against an ash mage. Shields are useless. Anything that can be turned to dust is useless. Maeve said there are two ways to deal with an ash mage. The first is to kill him before he gets within range. With an arrow, a bolt, anything, from a distance. The second is to run. Daniel chose the first. But to do that, you need to know how the mage works, what protects him, how fast he acts, whether he wears armor, whether he has a shield. He questioned Kern. Kern had fought the Valharats. He'd seen the ash mage once, from a distance. Kern said that the mage walked across the battlefield and everything around him died. Arrows crumbled in midair before reaching their target. But Kern hesitated. Then he said that the mage walked slowly, very slowly, as if every step cost him effort. And after the battle, the mage lay on the ground and didn't move for half a day. They carried him away on a stretcher. Daniel listened. He analyzed. The mage expends energy, a lot of energy. The more he burns, the weaker he becomes. His power is finite. He's not a god. He's a man with a battery. The battery is powerful, but it runs out. So the tactic is simple. Force him to expend energy before he reaches the people. Give him targets you don't mind losing. A tree, rocks, dirt. Let him burn them. Let him use up his energy. And when he gets tired, a bullet down his throat. He shared the idea with Maeve. Maeve thought about it for a long time. Then she said it might work if the mage really does get tired. If he can't choose what to burn and what not to. If he's leading the way instead of hiding behind the ranks. A lot of ifs. But there are no other ideas. Daniel began setting traps for the mage, not mines, but something else. Wooden shields, large, heavy, set up on the approaches to the bridge. The mage will go first. He'll see the shields. He'll start burning them. Every shield buys time. Every shield is energy the mage will waste. Behind the shields there's nothing. No one. Just planks. He placed 12 shields in a checkerboard pattern on the field in front of the bridge. Between them are paths. Narrow. Winding. The infantry will follow the paths. Slowly. In single file. Under fire from the rampart. If the mage goes first and burns the shields, he'll expose the infantry. If the infantry goes first, they'll run into the shields and get stuck. Maeve added her own idea. Pits. Shallow ones. Knee-deep. Camouflaged with branches. Not meant to kill, just to make them stumble. To break their formation. To make them pause for a second. A second under crossbow fire is an eternity. 20 days until their arrival. Hannah forged non-stop. Arrowheads, bolts, shield clasps, hinges for the gate. She worked 14 hours a day. She was losing weight. She was growing pale. She didn't complain. Daniel noticed. He came in the evening. He stood in the doorway of the smithy. He said she needed to sleep. Hannah replied that she would sleep when the enemy was gone. Daniel said that if she collapsed at the anvil from exhaustion, the enemy wouldn't even need to come. Hannah looked at him. Angry eyes. Red hair stuck to her forehead. Soot on her cheeks. She said her father had died because there was no one to repair the mechanism. She wouldn't let anyone die because she didn't have enough arrowheads. Daniel said nothing. Then he sat down next to her on the bench. He sat there. He was silent. Hannah stood with the hammer in her hand. Then she put the hammer down. She sat down next to him, shoulder to shoulder. They sat in silence together. 10 minutes later, she fell asleep. Just like that. Sitting up, leaning against his shoulder. He didn't move. He sat there, listening to her breathe. Heavily, steadily, like a bell after the bellows have stopped pumping. He sat there like that for 2 hours. Then he gently laid her down on the bench. He covered her with his apron. He left. In the morning, Hannah woke up. She saw the apron. She didn't say anything. But all day long she forged more quietly, more carefully. And twice she caught herself smiling for no reason. 15 days until the arrival. A woman came to Holmgard, alone, on foot, with a small bag on her back. Young, 22 years old, black-haired, with delicate features that betrayed foreign blood. She spoke the language of Aldrin with a soft accent, an Eastern one. Her name was Soyeon Park. She introduced herself as a traveling scholar from the distant island kingdom of Haran, the daughter of a diplomat, traveling, studying crafts, taking notes. Gort wanted to send her away. A stranger, from the east, unfamiliar. Daniel looked at her hands. Ink on her fingers, calluses from a writing brush. Not from a shovel, not from a sword, from a brush. He asked what she wanted. Soyeon replied that she'd heard of a master who'd built a water wheel and a hammer. She wanted to see it and record it. Daniel asked why. Soyeon replied that knowledge that isn't recorded dies with the master. She wanted it to live on. Daniel looked at her for a long time. In her eyes was that politeness backed by steel. She wasn't asking for permission. She was presenting him with a fait accompli. Politely, with a bow, but a fait accompli nonetheless. He showed her the smithy, the water wheel, the hammer, the forge, the mill, the crossbow, the plow, everything, without holding anything back. Soyeon took notes, quickly, precisely, in small handwriting in a notebook made of thin paper. She didn't ask silly questions. Every question was to the point. Why the blade angle was exactly that. Why the bearing was copper and not wood. Why the bolts were all the same size. Daniel answered, and with every answer, he saw how she understood. Not just repeating, but the difference. When he explained the principle behind standardizing the bolts, Soyeon paused. She looked up from her notebook. She looked at him. And she said that this wasn't a craft, it was a philosophy. Daniel replied that it was engineering. Soyeon replied that in her world, they were one and the same. That evening, they sat by the fire. Soyeon showed him her notes, the drawings she'd copied from his plaques. Precise, detailed, with annotations in the Haran language. Daniel asked what she was going to do with them. Soyeon replied that she would send them home to her teacher. So they could build it on Haran too. Daniel was silent. Then he said she could copy everything, distribute everything, send it to anyone. Knowledge shouldn't belong to just one person. Soyeon froze. In Aldrin, masters were killed for stealing secrets. The guild executed those who passed on blueprints without permission. But this man simply said, "Take it." She asked why. Daniel said that in his world, one man figured out how to make steel cheaply. He didn't hide the secret, he told everyone. And 50 years later, the world had changed. Bridges, roads, houses, ships, everything made of steel, all of it cheap. He didn't give a name, he couldn't. But he remembered. Bessemer, the man who gave and received more than he would have hidden. Soyeon listened. Then she closed her notebook. She stood up. She bowed. Deeply, the way one bows to a teacher, not a master. She said she wouldn't leave. She would stay. She would write it all down, everything. So that someday, in the world where it all began, in a dirty village at the edge of the world, people would know. They would know that one man opened the door and didn't close it behind him. Daniel nodded. Welcome. 10 days until the arrival. The observers on the southern hill have reported it. Smoke. Lots of smoke. To the southeast, a village is on fire. A 3-hour journey. The Valharadi are already here. Sooner than expected. Daniel called a council. Maeve, Gort, Kern, Hannah, Alvin, Soyeon. Lyra stood by the wall and listened. No one told her to leave. Maeve said they had 28 crossbows, 12 pikes, 8 mines, 14 trained archers, plus 10 men from Crowmead who arrived a week ago. A total of 24 fighters, against 200, and a mage. Gord said it was madness. They had to leave, head north, into the woods. Daniel asked where. Gort didn't answer, because there was no answer. To the north lay the woods. Cold, hunger, death. A slow death instead of a quick one. Kern said that running away wouldn't do any good. He'd been on the run for 3 months. He knows. Maeve said the position was good. The bridge is narrow. The flanks are marshy. If the enemy attacks head-on, the crossbows will mow down the front ranks before they reach the rampart. If they flank through the swamp, they'll get bogged down and the archers will pick them off from the flank. There's just one problem. The mage. Daniel said the mage was his problem. He'll figure it out. He has 10 days. Maeve looked at him. Her eyes said she didn't believe him, but she nodded, because there was no other choice. Daniel went into the smithy. He closed the door. He sat down on the floor. He thought. The Mage of Ash burns everything within a 10-step radius. Wood, metal, flesh. It drains things. It takes something from them. What exactly? Cohesion, structure, the energy of bonds. Daniel thought like an engineer. If magic takes the energy of bonds from a material, what is there that it cannot take? What has no structure that can be destroyed? 3 days until the arrival. Dara didn't sleep. No one slept. Maeve conducted the final drills. At night, in the rain. She roused everyone with a whistle at 3 o'clock. The archers ran to their positions in 4 minutes. She wanted it done in 3, but 4 was acceptable. The pikemen took their places behind the rampart. A line of 12 people, men and women. Their pikes planted in the ground, points forward. A living wall. Behind them were the reserves, 10 people with axes and knives. The last line of defense. If the pikemen fall, these 10 must buy time for the archers to retreat to the mill. Daniel stood in the rear. His place was by the signal whistle. He wouldn't shoot. He wouldn't swing a sword. He would coordinate. 2 short whistles meant to shift fire to the left. 3 short ones to the right. 1 long whistle meant to retreat to the mill. 2 long whistles meant everyone should retreat to the village. 3 long whistles meant to run. Maeve said the 3rd signal wouldn't be needed. Daniel didn't argue, but the whistle was ready. 2 days until their arrival. Daniel entered the children's house. Lyra was sitting by the stove. She was drawing. Theo was asleep. Ronan was asleep on the cot. Warm, stretched out. Daniel sat down next to Lyra. He said nothing. She didn't look up. She was drawing something. He looked. It wasn't a diagram of a mechanism. It was a drawing. A house. With smoke coming from the chimney. With a door. With 3 figures by the door. A big one, a smaller one, a very small one, and a 4th one nearby. A man. Standing slightly to the side, as if he'd just arrived. Lyra covered the drawing with her hand. Daniel didn't ask. He knew what was drawn. A family. The one that used to be. The one she wants back. And him. The 4th one. The one who came and took the place of the one who's gone. He said that after the fight, they needed to talk. About something important. Lyra said she knew. He didn't ask what she knew. Maybe she knows he's different. Maybe she suspects it. Maybe she just senses that this conversation is long overdue. He stood up. He touched the top of her head with his palm, just as the real Dane used to do. He knew this from fragments of someone else's memory. Lyra froze under his hand. For a second. Then she started drawing again. 1 day before the arrival. Morning. The lookout on the southern hill whistled twice. Horsemen. 2 of them. They weren't Valharadi. They were Baron Hask's scouts. Maeve intercepted them as they approached, with 5 archers. The scouts saw the crossbows. They stopped. The leader asked who was in charge. Maeve replied that the leader was busy. They could speak with her. The leader smirked. He said that Baron Hask was offering protection. He'd heard that the Valharadi were on their way. He was ready to send 20 horsemen, in exchange for an oath. The village of Holmgard would come under the Baron's authority. Taxes. Submission, as is customary. Maeve listened. Then she replied that the village of Holmgard thanked Baron Husk for his concern, and declined the offer. The scout turned pale. He asked if she understood that without Husk's protection, the village would be burned to the ground. Maeve replied that perhaps it would, but it's better to burn as free people than to live on our knees. The scouts left. Maeve returned and reported to Daniel. He nodded. He said she'd answered correctly. Maeve replied that it wasn't her who'd answered. It was him. Just through her voice. Evening. The last evening before the battle. Daniel gathered everyone together. Not for a speech. For dinner. Martha had cooked a stew. A thick one. With meat. She'd slaughtered the last goat. Daniel wanted to object. Martha looked at him in such a way that he kept quiet. The people ate, in silence, crowded together, shoulder to shoulder. Daniel watched them. 62 people, the residents of Homeguard, people from Crowmead, refugees from the south. 3 months ago they were strangers to one another, hungry, frightened, broken. Now they sat together and ate from a single pot. And tomorrow they would stand together. Some of them would die. He knew it. They knew it. No one spoke. Ronan sat on Kieran's lap, playing with a wooden horse. Kieran pretended he wanted to take it away. Ronan squealed and cackled. That sound, a child's laughter on the night before the battle. Daniel would remember it forever. Night. Daniel wasn't sleeping. He was sitting in the smithy, checking the crossbows, every single one by one. The trigger, the bowstring, the bolt, the sight. 28 of them, 28 checks. Then the bolts, 600 of them, every one straight, each with a sharp tip, each identical. He ran them through his fingers like prayer beads. Hannah walked in. Silently, she sat down next to him. She picked up a crossbow. She began checking them alongside him. They worked in silence for 2 hours. Then Hannah said she was afraid. Daniel said he was afraid too. Hannah looked at him. Then she said she didn't believe him. He didn't look like someone who was afraid. Daniel replied that fear isn't on your face. Fear is in your stomach. And right now, his stomach felt cold and empty. Just like before that night shift, when he knew the press was malfunctioning, but went out to work anyway because someone had to. Hannah didn't understand half of what he said, but she got the gist. He's afraid, yet he keeps going. She nodded, and went back to checking the bolts. Dawn. Gray. Cold. Fog over the stream. The lookout on the southern hill blew his whistle. 3 long blasts. Infantry. They're here. Maeve roused everyone with a single word. The archers ran to their positions. The halberdiers took up positions behind the rampart. The reserves behind the mill. Daniel took his post. The hill behind the mill. From here you can see the entire field. The bridge, the rampart, decoy shields, paths between them, the swamp on the flanks. Lyra was standing next to him. He told her to leave. She refused. He told her again. She looked at him and said that if he died, she wanted to see it. Not hide in the cellar and wait, to see it. He didn't argue. There was no time. They emerged from the fog. Infantry. Gray figures in leather armor, wide shields, short swords. They marched in even formation, unhurriedly, confidently. This wasn't their first time. They burned villages, took the iron. Left. Routine. A man in black led the way. Short, thin, his hood pulled down over his face. He walked slowly. The grass beneath his feet wasn't turning black. Not yet. He was conserving his strength. Behind him was the infantry, 6 ranks of 30. No. Daniel had miscounted. 5 ranks of 30. 150, not 200. So 50 had stayed with the supply train or taken a different route. 150 against 24. Maeve stood behind the mill with Kern and Hannah. 3 crossbows were aimed at a single point, the mage. The Valharat infantry had reached the shields. They stopped. An officer shouted something. The mage stepped forward. He raised his hands. Daniel saw it from the hill, 100 paces away, far away, but he saw it. The first shield. The wood darkened, turned gray, crumbled. In a second, the planks turned to sawdust. Sawdust to dust. The dust settled. No shield. The mage stepped toward the next one. The second shield. The same thing. Sawdust. Dust. Nothing. The third. The fourth. The mage walked across the field, and the shields crumbled before him like houses of cards. The infantry followed him, confidently. They'd seen this before. Their mage was invincible. The 5th shield. 6th. Daniel was counting. Every shield was energy. Every shield was seconds of life the mage was spending on the tree. 8th. 9th. The mage slowed down. Just a little. But Daniel noticed. It was working. The battery was running low. 10th. 11th. The mage stopped. He stood there, breathing. Then he moved on. More slowly. 12th. The last shield. Rubble. Dust. The field was clear. The infantry saw the bridge, the rampart, sharpened stakes, and people behind the rampart, with crossbows. The officer shouted the command. The infantry ran. Along the paths between the spots where the shields had stood, the first row reached the pits. 3 men fell through. They fell. The formation broke. Daniel blew his whistle. 1 short blast. Fire. 14 crossbows fired in unison. The first volley struck the thick of the crowd. From 50 paces away, it's impossible to miss a tight formation. 9 men fell. Screams. Chaos. The second volley 20 seconds later. 7 more. The Valharadi weren't expecting it. A village full of peasants. 3 volleys and already 22 dead. They retreated, back behind the line of pits. The officer was yelling. He was reorganizing them. Daniel looked at the mage. The mage stood behind the formation. He didn't move. He was gathering his strength. Or perhaps he couldn't move. It was hard to tell. The infantry advanced again. This time, shields first, shielding their heads. Crossbow bolts struck the shields. The wood cracked but held. A few bolts slipped through the cracks. 3 more fell, but the rest pressed on. They reached the mines. Daniel blew his whistle. 2 short blasts. The observer lit the fuse. 3 seconds. An explosion. Not loud, a muffled one. The earth flew up. The pot burst open. Nails and debris lashed out at the formation. 4 fell. Another explosion to the right. 3 more. Panic. The Valharadi ran back. Then they stopped. They regrouped. They were soldiers. Professionals. The panic lasted 10 seconds. Then discipline took over. An officer led them around. Across the swamp. The right flank. Just as Maeve had predicted. They got stuck. Knee-deep in mud. Slowly, with difficulty. Their shields weighed them down. Daniel blew his whistle. 2 short blasts. The archers shifted their fire to the flank. Shooting at targets stuck in the swamp was like a training exercise. 12 more fell. The Valharadi retreated again. They regrouped. And then the mage moved forward. Alone. Without infantry. He was heading straight for the bridge. Slowly. Every step was heavy. But he kept going. The ground beneath his feet turned black. The grass was dying. The water in the puddles evaporated instantly. Daniel saw how the sharpened stakes in front of the bridge began to darken, to rot, to crumble. Wood. Maeve saw it. She waited. 30 steps. 25. 20. Maeve shouted. 3 archers on the wall hurled clay pots. White clay balls flew toward the mage. The first one shattered 2 paces in front of him. A cloud of white dust rose into his face. The second one struck him in the chest. The pot split open. Lime dust filled his eyes. The mage screamed. The first human sound he'd ever made. A scream of pain. His hands flew up to his face. 3 crossbows fired simultaneously. Maeve, Kern, Hannah. 60 paces. 3 bolts. The first one missed. The second struck his shoulder. The mage flinched. The third bolt struck his thigh. The mage fell to his knees. The ground around him bucked. The grass within a 5-step radius turned to ash. But he was weakening. Daniel could see it. His battery was dead. The mage tried to stand. Maeve reloaded. She fired. The bolt struck his chest. The mage fell face first to the ground. He didn't move. Silence. 2 seconds of silence that lasted an eternity. Then a shout, a scream. Not from the Valharadi, from the people on the rampart. A cry of victory. Maeve didn't shout. She lowered her crossbow. Her hands were shaking, but her face was stony. The Valharat infantry saw that the mage had fallen. The officer stood and watched. Then he turned and said something to his men. They gathered the wounded. They lifted the mage. He was alive. Wounded. Unconscious. But alive. And they left. Slowly. In an orderly fashion. They didn't run. They walked away. Like professionals who tally their losses and decide the cost is too high. Daniel stood on the hill and counted. His losses. Maeve was already counting down below. He saw her walking along the rampart, bending down, checking. 9. 9 people. 4 dead. 5 wounded. 3 critically. 4 dead. He came down from the hill. He approached the first body. A man from Crowmead. He didn't know his name. An arrow in his throat. The Valharat archers had been firing from the flank while the infantry crossed the marsh. He hadn't noticed. Maeve hadn't noticed. No one had noticed. After the battle, Daniel threw himself into his work as if it were second nature. Don't think. Just do. When his hands are busy, his mind is quiet. He rebuilt the rampart. Higher. Thicker. With a stone foundation. Now, if the Ash Mage returns, he'll have to burn the stone. And stone doesn't burn. He repaired the bridge. Reinforced the mill. He widened the battlements. He built backup positions in 3 directions. Maeve was in charge. He built. 2 weeks passed in silence. The Valharati didn't return. Maeve's scouts reported that they'd been spotted 2 days' journey to the southeast. They're leaving. A wounded mage on a stretcher. The losses are too great for a raid. They won't come back. Not these ones. Maybe others. Later. But not now. Daniel exhaled. For the first time in a month. And he set about doing what he'd been putting off. The wounded. 3 in critical condition. 1 with a severed shoulder. 1 with a bolt in his leg. 1 with a burn on his arm from ash magic. He'd grazed the edge of the blast zone. The skin on his arm had turned gray. Dry. Like the bark of an old tree. Martha treated them as best she could. Herbs, bandages, hot decoctions. But 2 of them were getting worse. The wound with the bolt had become infected. The ash burn was spreading. Daniel needed a doctor. He didn't have a doctor. But he had Iris Vetch. She arrived on the 3rd day after the battle, from the forest, barefoot, with a basket of herbs, with a goat on a rope. The goat followed her like a dog. Iris was 19, slender, dark hair down to her waist. Her eyes were green and wary, like a cat waiting to be kicked. She had lived alone in the forest ever since her mother was burned. 5 years. Alone. With goats and herbs and the knowledge her mother had passed on to her, and for which her mother had died. She had come because she'd heard there were wounded people in Holmgard, and because she knew how to heal. And because staying silent when you know how to heal and someone is dying is worse than being burned at the stake. Gort saw her and crossed himself with the sign of the flame. A witch. A herbalist from the forest. The daughter of a woman who was burned at the stake. Trouble. Daniel looked at Gort, then at Iris, then at the wounded man with the festering leg. He told Gort that if this man died because they were afraid to accept help, the sin would not lie with the witch. It would lie with them. Gort fell silent. Iris walked over to the wounded man, silently, without asking permission. She looked at the wound with the bolt in it. She sniffed it. She touched it. Her face grew stern. She said the wound was festering. If the pus wasn't cleaned out today, the leg was lost. If the leg was lost, the man would be dead in 3 days. She asked for boiling water, a hot cloth, a knife, a sharp one, a very sharp one, and light, lots of light. Daniel gave her everything. He stood nearby and held the lantern while she worked. 2 hours. Iris cut. She cleaned. She rinsed the wound with a decoction that smelled so bad it made Daniel queasy. She applied bandages made of leaves he didn't recognize. The wounded man screamed. Then he lost consciousness. Then his breathing evened out. Iris stood up. Her hands were covered in blood. Her face was pale. She said he would live if the fever subsided by morning. The fever subsided. Daniel came to check on him every 2 hours. Iris didn't leave. She sat nearby. She changed the bandages. She gave him something to drink. By morning, the wounded man opened his eyes and asked for water. Iris gave it to him. Then she went outside. She sat down on the ground. She closed her eyes. She sat there for an hour. Daniel didn't disturb her. Then he approached. He sat down beside her. He was silent for a moment. Then he said she needed to look at something. She opened her eyes. She looked at him in surprise. People didn't usually tell her she needed to look at something. People usually told her to go away. He led her to the blacksmith's shop. On the workbench lay something wrapped in leather. He unwrapped it. A tube, long, made of wood. At one end, an eyepiece. At the other, a small frame with two lenses. The lenses were made of glass. No, not glass. Made of polished pieces of rock crystal. Transparent. Clear. Olven had found them in the hills a week ago. 2 crystals. Daniel had polished them for 3 days. By hand, on a wet stone. He shaped them.
Convex and plano-convex.
The magnification is weak. Maybe 10 times. Maybe 15. But it's enough. He placed a bowl of water in front of Iris. He dripped a drop from a puddle by the cowshed into it. A murky drop. Daniel showed her how to look. One eye closed. The tube to the other. Focus on the drop. Iris looked. For a long time. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. 2 minutes. Then she raised her head. Her eyes were huge. She asked what it was. Daniel replied that it was what lives in dirty water. What causes wounds to fester. What makes children sick. What kills without being seen. Iris pressed her face against the tube again. She watched for an hour. She changed the drops. Clean water from the well. Dirty water from a puddle. A decoction of her herbs. Boiled water. She compared them. Silently. Intently. Like someone who had known all her life that the answer existed and suddenly saw it. Then she raised her head. Her eyes were wet. She said one sentence. So Mom was right. Her mother used to say that illness is neither a curse nor a sin. Illness is made up of tiny creatures that get inside you. Dirt, rot, mold. Her mother treated illness with cleanliness. She boiled water.
She washed her hands.
She rinsed wounds. For that, they burned her. The Church of the Flame taught that illness was punishment for sins. To treat it was to defy the will of the flame. Her mother defied it. And she burned. And now her daughter looks into the tube and sees that her mother was right. Daniel stood in silence. He didn't know what to say. Because there are no words that can fix this. 5 years of loneliness. Her mother at the stake. The fear that you too will be burned for knowing the truth. He couldn't fix that. But he could give her a tool. He told her that this phone was hers. And that if she wanted to, she could stay. And heal. Openly. Without fear. Because as long as he was alive, no one would burn her for her knowledge. Iris was silent. Then she took the pipe. She pressed it to her chest, just as Theo had pressed the urn containing her mother's ashes. Exactly the same way. With the same intensity. Iris stayed. She treated the wounded. All 3 survived. Even the one with a burn from the ash magic. Iris discovered that a decoction made from white willow bark relieved his pain, and bandages made of moss and honey drew the dryness out of the skin.
The ash magic had taken away the moisture.
Iris restored it, not with magic, with knowledge. A month after the battle, Daniel stood by the stream and looked at the water. Autumn had come, the first frosts. The leaves had turned yellow. The stream had run dry. The water wheel turned more slowly. It was time to think about winter. Supplies, firewood, insulation, clothing, footwear, food. The harvest had been good, better than expected. The plow had done its job. The turnips had grown. The grain had come up evenly. There were no potatoes in this world, but there were beans. Lots of beans. Martha had preserved them, dried them, salted them. She smoked whatever she could. Maeve organized a hunt. The deer in the forest were fat and unafraid. They smoked the meat and hung it in the cellar. Daniel did the math. The supplies would last through the winter, just barely, unless new refugees arrived. But refugees would come, he knew it, and he wouldn't be able to turn them away, so they'd need more. He thought about fish. The stream was too shallow for fish. But 3 hours' walk to the north, there was a lake. Gord had told him about it. There were fish there, lots of them. No one fished there because the lake was on Baron Hask's land. Fishing without permission was theft. The punishment is having your right hand cut off. Daniel looked at his hands. Right, left. He needed both. But the children wanted to eat too. He sent Kern with 5 men. Quietly, at night, with the nets Martha had woven. They returned 3 days later with 2 carts full of fish. Salted. Smoked right on the shore. The smell wafted throughout the village. Gort shook his head. He said it would end badly. Daniel replied that starvation would end worse. Eloise Myrn arrived in Holmgard on the first day of November. Rain, cold, mud up to her knees. She walked on foot, alone, in a dress that had once been expensive but was now wet and dirty, wearing gloves. She didn't take off her gloves. Daniel later found out why. Beneath the gloves, her hands were worn down to the flesh from washing other people's laundry. The hands of a noblewoman that looked like those of a laundress. She was ashamed. Eloise was the daughter of Viscount Mern. The Mern family had once owned lands by the river. Now they owned nothing. The war had taken their lands. Debts had taken their home. Her father had died of shame. Literally, his heart couldn't take it. Her mother and two sisters lived in a rented room in town. Eloise did laundry. She sewed. She did whatever she could. She had come to Home Guard because she'd heard they offered work here. Any kind of work. She was ready for anything. Daniel looked at her. 26 years old. Beautiful. Her back was straight, even in the rain. Her voice was steady. Not a single tear. Not a single complaint. The steely poise of someone who is crumbling on the inside, but stands tall on the outside. He didn't give her the job as a laundress. He asked what languages she knew. Eloise was surprised. Then she answered. Oldrin, Valharat, Huron, Old Runic, Southern Trade. 5 languages. He asked if she could count. She said she had kept her father's household accounts for the last 3 years of his life. The balance sheet. Winter set in early. In mid-November, the first snow covered Home Guard up to the ankles. A week later, up to the knees. The stream froze at the banks, but the middle still flowed. The water wheel turned more slowly. The hammer struck less often. But it still struck. Daniel had been preparing for winter since summer. Firewood was stockpiled. Brick stoves stood in 4 of the houses. The rest were insulated with clay and moss, according to his calculations. The cracks were caulked. The roofs were reinforced. He remembered the winters in Seoul. 10 below. It was worse here. 20 below as far as he could tell. He didn't have a thermometer. But his body remembered. Home Guard's population had grown to 78 people. 12 refugees had arrived after the battle. A family of 4, an old man with his granddaughter, 2 nameless men who didn't want to say where they were from, and a woman with an infant. Daniel took them all in. Gort stopped objecting. He simply stood by the gate and counted those coming in, silently. The first problem of winter wasn't the cold. It was footwear. Half the people simply didn't have any. They walked in wrappings of leather and rags. In the snow, that meant frostbite within an hour. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. Then he made them. Winter boots. A simple design. A wooden sole made from a single piece of linden wood, hollowed out to fit the foot. The upper was made of felt. They made the felt from sheep's wool.
There weren't many sheep, but there was enough wool.
The felt was attached to the sole through slits and leather straps. Not pretty, not elegant, but warm and quick to make. 1 pair in 40 minutes if the sole is already cut out. He put Kern in charge of the soles. Martha and 3 women worked on the felt. Hannah made the fastenings. Eric assembled them. 3 days, 78 pairs. 1 for every foot in the village. People put them on and couldn't believe it. Warm, dry. Their feet weren't cold. An elderly refugee woman put on the boots and burst into tears. Not out of gratitude, out of the warmth. Simply from the physical sensation of warm feet after a month of walking barefoot on the frozen ground. Daniel watched. He turned away. He went into the blacksmith shop. Because if he stood there watching people cry over warm boots, he'd start crying too. And engineers don't cry. They make boots. The second problem with winter was boredom. It sounds silly. But in winter, when the days are short and the nights are endless, and there's no work in the fields, people start to think. And when people who've lost everything start thinking, they think about what they've lost.
And it drives them crazy. Or they get drunk. Or they fight.
Daniel saw it. The first fight broke out in the second week of December. 2 men among the refugees couldn't agree on who got the spot by the stove. Kern broke it up. But that was just the beginning. Daniel found a solution. A school. He gathered the children, 14 of them, ranging in age from 4 to 13. Lyra helped. She became a teacher, not by his appointment, but simply by starting to explain to the little ones what she knew. Numbers, lines, angles. How to draw a perfect circle. How to count to 100. Daniel taught the older ones, not reading and writing. He taught them a trade, how to hold a file, how to identify metal by its sound, how to tell which wood is dry and which is green. Practice, hands, mind. Then Soyeon suggested teaching languages. Haran. She said that knowing a language is the key to trade, and trade is life. Eloise began teaching etiquette and arithmetic. Iris taught about herbs. Which one is for what? How to gather them. How to store them. How to brew them. The school got off the ground. Not officially. Just every evening people would sit in the great hall and learn. Children and adults, together. By midwinter, the fights had stopped. People were busy. Their minds were busy. Their hands were busy. A body that is learning has no time for despair. The third problem of winter was Lyra. Not a problem, a wound. She came to him in January, in the evening, when everyone was asleep. She stood in the doorway of the smithy. He was sitting by the forge, designing a steam boiler. Theoretically, on a clay tablet. Far from being ready for implementation, but the design had to be ready by spring. Lyra said she wanted to ask him something. Daniel set the tablet aside. She asked who he was. He remained silent. She said she knew, that he wasn't Dane, that Dane never calculated, never drew, never built. Dane sat in the corner sharpening the sword. Dane was kind but empty, like a beautiful jug with no water inside. But he was full, to the brim, with a different kind of water. She said she wasn't angry, that she'd been thinking about it for 3 months, that at first she was afraid. Then she hated him. Then she watched him make a knife for Martha, how he built a wheel, how he taught Hannah, how he buried Bran, and she stopped hating him. Because whoever he was, he stayed. He didn't leave. He promised that no one would die, and when people did die, he dug the graves himself. Dane wouldn't have dug. Dane would have stood there and cried. But he dug. She asked one thing. Is Dane alive? Somewhere inside? Or is he gone? Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he told the truth, that Dane is gone, that what remains is his memory, fragments, feelings, the warmth when Lyra takes his hand, the fear for Ronan when he coughs at night. These are Dane's feelings. They remain. But Dane as a person is gone. Someone else has taken over his body. Someone from a place she can't even imagine. He said his name was Daniel, that he'd been an engineer, that he'd died saving a child, and that he hadn't chosen this body, didn't ask for it, didn't want it. But he got it. And along with the body, he got 3 children. And he won't give them up. To no one. Not to the gods. Not to fate. Not to the real Dane if he ever returns. Because he is Daniel Coe from Seoul, and in his life he has learned one thing. If someone near you needs help, you help them. Not because you have to, because you can. Lyra listened. Her face was stony, her eyes were dry. She didn't cry. She'd forgotten how. The silence lasted a minute. Then she walked over, sat down beside him, rested her head on his shoulder, and said she didn't care what his name was. He was her brother, because he'd stayed. Daniel didn't move. He barely breathed. Then he slowly placed his hand on her head, just as Dane used to do, just as he himself had done 100 times before, but for the first time without lying, for the first time honestly. They sat like that until morning, in silence. The horn was cooling. The embers were dying down. The wind howled outside the wall. But it was warm here. By the end of winter, there were 78 people in Holmgard wearing warm boots. A working blacksmith shop, a school, 14 archers, food supplies for another 2 months, 3 allied villages, Crow's Meadow. 2 others had joined after the battle. They'd seen that Holmgard had stood its ground against the Valharadi and decided it was safer to be near it. Eloise had signed trade agreements with 2 merchants, plows and tools in exchange for cloth, salt, and tin. Tin. Daniel was as happy as a child about it. Tin plus copper equals bronze. Bronze means bearings, proper ones, durable ones. He smelted his first bronze in February. Hot, molten, beautiful. He poured it into a mold, a bearing, even, smooth. He mounted it on the water wheel's axle. The wheel spun so smoothly that Olvin said it was singing, and it really was singing. A quiet, steady hum. No creaking, no clattering. Music. Daniel stood there and listened, and he thought that in the spring he needed to build a second wheel, and a third, and a sawmill, and a lathe, and start the steam boiler project. Because water is good, but steam is power, real power, the kind that will change everything. Spring came in March. The snow began to melt. The streams swelled. The water wheel spun with double the force. The hammer pounded like a giant's heart. Thud, thud, thud. Holmgard was waking up. People came out of their houses. They squinted into the sun. Children ran toward the stream. Ronan stood on the bank and laughed as he watched the water. He was almost 4. He spoke in complete sentences. He called Daniel his brother. Theo no longer carried the urn with the ashes. The urn stood on a shelf. Theo went to school. She could count to 100. The royal emissary arrived in April. Not alone. With him came 20 mounted guards in polished, and 1 man in a dark cloak without a coat of arms. Daniel stood at the gate and watched. Maeve stood behind him. 24 crossbowmen were in position, out of sight, but ready. The emissary's name was Lord Chiron de Moore, 50 years old, gray-haired, withered, with the face of a man who had seen it all and was by anything. He dismounted. He looked at the village, at the water wheel, at the brick kilns, at the wall, at the mill, at the people who hadn't scattered at the sight of the royal guard but stood and watched, calmly, with crossbows on their backs. De Moore turned to Daniel. He said he had come on behalf of King Aldrin III with a proposal. Daniel invited him into the house. Eloise greeted them. In a clean dress, with her back straight, wearing gloves. She spoke in impeccable courtly Aldrin. Dumore looked at her. He recognized her bearing. He recognized her accent. He asked where she was from. Eloise replied that she was of the Mern family. Dumore raised an eyebrow. He knew the house of Mern. He knew they were ruined. He knew the Viscount had died. And here his daughter stood before him in a village at the edge of the world, speaking like a minister. They sat down. Martha served tea, made from iris herbs, hot, with honey. Dumore drank and spoke. The offer was simple. A title. Baron Holmgard. The lands officially assigned to Daniel. A seat on the Royal Council of Crafts. Gold for development. In exchange for one thing. All the blueprints. All the inventions. All technologies. Belonging to the crown. A monopoly. Not a single part would leave the confines of the royal order. Not a single plow would be sold without the king's seal. Daniel listened. Eloise took notes. Soyon sat in the corner and took notes as well. Dumore didn't know that her notebook already contained a complete copy of every blueprint in the smithy. Daniel waited until Dumore finished. Then he asked one question. He asked what would happen to the peasants who were already using his plows, in Crow's Meadow and in the other 2 villages. What would happen to their tools? Dumore answered directly. Confiscation. The crown takes everything made without a license. That's the law. Daniel nodded. Then he stood up. He walked over to the wall. He took a clay tablet off it, a drawing of a plow, the first one Lyra had drawn as he dictated it, and showed it to Dumore. He asked if he could see the signature. Dumore looked. There was a signature, small, in the corner, in a child's handwriting, Lyra Velen. Daniel said that this drawing had been made by a 13-year-old girl, his sister, and that if the crown wanted to take his work, let it take it. But the crown wouldn't get this girl's work, because the girl is not a subject of the crown. She is a free person, and her drawings belong to her. Dumore remained silent. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected a bargain. How much gold? What title? What privileges? He hadn't expected a drawing with a child's signature. Daniel continued. He said he was refusing. The title, the gold, from a seat on the council, from everything. Not because he didn't want it, but because the condition was impossible. Knowledge does not belong to any one person. Not to him, not to the king, not to the guild. Knowledge belongs to the hands that work, and he would not be the one to take away those hands right. Dumore stood up. His face was stony. He said that Daniel was making a mistake, that the crown does not ask twice, that next time they would not come with an offer. Daniel replied that he knew. Do more left. 20 guards followed him. A man in a dark cloak lingered at the gate. He looked at the village, at the people, at the crossbows. Then he rode off. Maeve said the man in the cloak was an investigator, the Crown's secret service. He was memorizing faces, counting weapons, assessing the defenses. Daniel nodded. He knew. From that day on, they were outlaws. Officially. Not fugitives, not bandits. Worse. Rebels. Whoever defies the king is against the king. There is no third option. He called a council. Maeve, Eloise, Gort, Alvin, Kern, Hannah, Soyun, Iris. Lyra stood by the wall. He had spoken the truth, that the crown would come again. With an army, not 20 guards, hundreds, maybe thousands, and that Home Guard alone would not hold out. They needed a network, a large one, many villages, many workshops, many people who will say the same thing he did. We refuse to starve. Eloise said she had contacts, 3 merchants in the west, 2 minor nobles who hate the guild and the crown equally, the city of Tyrmand on the northern coast, a free port, not directly subject to the crown. You can trade there without a stamp. Soyun said she'd send copies of the blueprints to Haran, via a merchant ship, 2 weeks to the coast, a month by sea. Even if Home Guard falls, knowledge will survive. The summer of the second year was hot and unsettling. Daniel was working. The network was growing. 7 villages were now connected to Home Guard: Crow's Meadow, Alderfin, Three Pines, and Bridgeway. Brickshore, Quiet Backwater, Salt Spring. Each had received a master craftsman trained at Home Guard. Each had its own smithy, its own plow, its own crossbows. Heloise coordinated trade among them. Caravans traveled the roads carrying goods: iron to the north, grain to the east, salt to the west, and cloth back again. No guild duties, no hallmarks, no permits. For the first time in 300 years, trade in these parts was free. The guild remained silent for a suspiciously long time. Maeve said it was the calm before the storm. She was right. In July, a guest arrived in Home Guard. Just one. On a magnificent horse. Wearing traveling clothes that cost more than the village's entire annual income before Daniel's arrival. Not young, 58 years old, gray temples, a neat beard, slender hands, well-groomed, but with a single callus on his right index finger, from a quill, or from a hammer. Master Valrin Korst, head of the Aldrin Capital Blacksmiths Guild. Maeve wanted to turn him away. Daniel told her to let him in. Korst entered. He looked around, slowly, carefully, like a man who knows how to see. He saw the water wheel and understood the mechanism. He saw the sawmill and understood the drive mechanism. He saw the steam boiler and turned pale. Just a little, for a second. But Daniel noticed. They sat down at the table. Martha served tea. Korst drank and spoke. Politely, quietly, no threats. He said he was amazed that in 30 years he hadn't seen anything like it. That the water hammer alone would change the guild's craft for a generation. And the steam boiler. Korst set down his cup. He looked Daniel in the eye. He said that the steam boiler meant the end of the world as they knew it. Daniel replied that he knew. Korst nodded. Then he told a story. 100 years ago, a master craftsman in southern Aldrin invented a loom. Simple. Fast. One woman working it could do the work of 5. He began selling the fabric cheaply. The guild warned him. He didn't listen. Then the weavers came. Not guild officials, just ordinary weavers. The ones who'd lost their jobs. They burned down his workshop. They killed his apprentices. They hanged him on his own loom. And do you know what happened next? Korst asked. Nothing. The loom disappeared. The blueprints were burned. The fabric became expensive again. And for another 50 years, women wove by hand, because no one dared to try it again. Korst was silent for a moment. Then he said he understood what Daniel wanted to do, and that it was noble, and that it was right. But the world isn't ready. Not because people are evil, but because people are afraid. A weaver who's been weaving by hand for 30 years, upon seeing a loom, doesn't see progress. He sees his children going hungry, and he'll burn the loom. Not out of malice, out of fear. Daniel listened, and he couldn't argue, because Korst was right. It was the same in his world. the Luddites, the machine breakers, those who smashed the machines because the machines were taking away their bread. And Daniel knew they were right to be afraid. The machines really did take away their bread. For a generation. Then things got better, but that generation had died out. He asked Korst what he was proposing. Korst replied, slowly, a compromise. The guild won't touch Homeguard, won't touch the allied villages. But the steam boiler, that must stay here. It must not spread. For now, let people get used to the plow, to the wheel, to the crossbow, one step at a time, not all at once. In 10 years, the world will be ready for steam. Not now. Daniel thought about it, all night long. Korst spent the night in the guest house. In the morning, Daniel went to see him. He said the answer was no. Not because Korst was wrong, but because in 10 years, he might be dead. And Korst might be dead. And the new guild leader might not be as sensible. And then everything would go back to the way it was. They'd take away the plows, they'd burn the wheels. 6 months is half a lifetime if you're building every day. Daniel announced a mobilization. Not a military one, a production one. Each of the 7 villages received an assignment. Crowmead is making crossbows. Olven is in charge. Alderfin is forging tips for pikes and bolts. Three Pines is harvesting timber. Bridgeway is making bricks. Brickshore is digging fortifications. Quiet Backwater is boiling saltpeter. Salt Spring is supplying food. Homeguard is the hub. This is where they gather. This is where they check. This is where they train. Lyra kept the records. Her ledgers turned into a real office. 3 assistants. Girls from school. 14 and 15 years old. They counted. They cross-checked. The world's first quality control department. Eloise worked on the diplomatic front. She traveled, a lot. Far away. Taking risks. Every trip could end in arrest. She knew it, and yet she went. 3 free cities on the coast. Tiermond, Crestvale, Marlow Harbor. Eloise spoke to them in their language, the language of profit. She offered trade agreements, plows, tools, crossbows, at a price 3 times lower than the guilds. No duties, no hallmarks. 2 cities agreed, Tiermond and Crestvale. They were free cities and didn't care about the guild. The 3rd refused. Marlow Harbor belonged to a baron who feared the crown. Eloise returned with money, silver, and a little gold, and with something even more valuable. Allies. Tiermond and Crestvale were ready to take in refugees if Homeguard fell. They were ready to keep the blueprints. They were ready to continue trading. Not out of altruism, out of self-interest. Homeguard plows plowed faster. Homeguard crossbows had a longer range. Homeguard tools lasted longer. Self-interest is the most reliable foundation for an alliance. Daniel knew this from the history of his world. Maeve was training an army. No longer a militia, an army. 80 archers from 7 villages, 20 halberdiers, 10 mounted scouts on horses bought from merchants, a signaling system of whistles and mirrors, 3 lines of defense, the bridge, the mill, the village, each with ramparts, with arrow slits, with 3 days' worth of bolts, water, and food. Daniel was working on weapons, not crossbows. They were good, but they wouldn't be enough against 3,000. He needed something new. He thought about a cannon, for a long time. But a cannon required bronze or cast iron. There wasn't enough bronze. There was no cast iron. There was no foundry. There wasn't time to learn how to cast. A dead end. He thought about rockets, gunpowder rockets. Simple ones. A tube packed with gunpowder with a hole at one end. Reactive thrust. Not accurate, not powerful, but incendiary and demoralizing. An army that had never seen rockets would panic upon seeing fiery tails streaking from the sky. For a second. But that second is decisive. He made 20 rockets, out of tin rolled into tubes, filled with gunpowder and iron scraps, with tail fins made from thin slats of wood. He conducted the test in a field. He lit the fuse. The rocket screeched. It flew 100 paces. It crashed into a haystack. The haystack burst into flames. Maeve watched. Then she said one word. More. He made 40 more. And launch rails. Wooden chutes at a 30-degree angle. 3 shoots, 4 rockets each. A volley. 12 fiery trails at once. In the dark, it would look like the end of the world. At the same time, he was working on a secret that kept him awake at night. The runic veins. Olven had told him about it that winter. A rune vein ran beneath the hills of Holmgard, depleted, dead. 200 years ago, rune iron had been mined from it. Then it fell silent, like all the veins in Uldren. The mages said the magic was gone. But Olven said otherwise. His grandfather, who had been a runic blacksmith, said the veins weren't dead. They were asleep, and that sometimes, very rarely, when the earth trembles from a shock, the veins respond. They tremble in response. For a moment, Daniel listened and thought. Vibration. Resonance. Every material has its own frequency of oscillation. If you apply a vibration of the right frequency, the material will respond. It will amplify it. That's basic physics. His steam hammer struck the anvil. The blow traveled into the ground, through the ground into the rock, through the rock into the vein. If the frequency of the blows matched the natural frequency of the runic metal in the vein, resonance. Awakening. The winter of the second year was different. Not quiet, not peaceful. Busy. 100 steps from the forge to the sawmill. From the sawmill to the casting pit. From the pit to the warehouse. Holmgard was no longer a village. It was a factory. Rough, noisy, smoky, but a factory nonetheless. Daniel barely slept. 4 hours a day. Soyeon took notes for him. Every word, every drawing, every decision. She said that if he died of exhaustion, at least the knowledge would remain. He didn't argue. She was right. In December, what he feared happened. The guild struck a real blow. Not with fire, with the law. A royal decree. It was read aloud in all of Aldrin's public squares. Anyone who buys, sells, stores, or uses goods without the guild's hallmark is declared an accomplice to treason. The punishment? Confiscation of property and imprisonment. For nobles, forfeiture of their title. For peasants, 10 years of hard labor. With a single decree, Korst cut Holmgard off from all buyers within the kingdom. Eloise returned from her trip looking pale. 2 out of 3 merchants had renounced their contracts. The third was wavering. A nobleman in the west sent a letter of apology. He could not risk his family. Daniel read the letter. Then he set it aside. He said he understood. He wasn't angry. A man protects his children. That's the right thing to do. Eloise asked what to do. Daniel answered with one word. Tiermund. A free city. Not subject to the decree. Maritime trade. Different rules. Eloise nodded. She went to Tiermund. She returned 3 weeks later, with a contract. Tiermund will take everything. Plows, crossbows, tools, bricks, even steam boilers, if Daniel can mass-produce them. The prices are a third lower than the guilds. The Tiermund merchants couldn't care less about decrees. They'd been trading with pirates and smugglers for 200 years. One rebellious blacksmith was no problem for them. Daniel exhaled. The trade route was secure. Money would come in. Silver to buy what was in short supply. Tin, copper, leather, cloth. But the decree struck elsewhere. It struck the people. 3 families from Alderfin left. They were scared. 2 families from Three Pines. 1 from Crowmead. They weren't cowards. They were people with children who didn't want to go to prison. Daniel didn't stop them. He gave each person who left a sack of grain and a pair of boots. And he told them that if they ever wanted to come back, the door was open. 2 returned a month later. The rest didn't. He wasn't angry. He didn't judge them. He just kept working. In January, news came about who was behind the murder of the Wellen family. Eloise found a lead. In Tiermund. Through an elderly notary who had handled the affairs of the late Viscount Mern. The notary knew a great deal. He explained that 2 months before the attack on the Wellen family, a secret meeting of the small council had taken place in the capital. Lord Chancellor Orton Grave was present. The second most powerful man in the kingdom after the king. Grave knew about the rune veins. He knew they weren't depleted but dormant. He knew that the Welland lands sat atop the richest of them all, and he knew the Wellands had to be eliminated, quietly, without a trace. Under the guise of a bandit raid, Lord Chancellor Grave ordered the murder of the Welland family to seize their land, and he would have taken it, if not for the war. The Valharat front had diverted all forces. The land remained up for grabs, and then Daniel appeared there, and everything went off course. Daniel listened to Eloise, silently, his face stony. A year passed, then another. His third spring in Adrian. Daniel stood on the bridge over the stream and looked at the water. The bridge was new, made of stone, with arches, built according to his blueprints. The first stone bridge in these parts in 200 years. 3 water wheels spun beneath it. Each drove its own mechanism. A hammer, a sawmill, a mill. Next to it stood the steam shop. 2 boilers, drives for a lathe and a drill press. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady and white. Holmgard was no longer a village, nor was it a factory. It had become something new, something for which there was no word yet in this world. 120 people lived here permanently. Another 300 lived in 7 surrounding settlements. All were connected, all worked, all ate. The Confederation of Northern Workshops. That's what Eloise called it. Not a state. Not a barony. Not a guild. A workshop. A large one. Free. Open. The school was in session every day. 32 students. 8 of them were girls. Lyra taught drafting and mathematics. She was 14 and knew more than any guildmaster. Soyan taught languages and managed the archives. Each drawing was copied 6 times. 2 sets were sent to Haran, 2 to Tiermond, 1 to Crossvale, 1 was buried in the forest. Knowledge was protected. Even if Holmgard burned to the ground, knowledge would survive. Iris opened a clinic. A small one, with a microscope on the table, with shelves of herbs, with clean bandages, with a rule she had hung on the wall. Wash your hands, boil water. Illness is not a punishment. Illness is filth. She had cured 43 people over the past year. 2 would have been dead without her. The Church of the Flame sent an investigator. He looked at the clinic, at the microscope, at Iris. Then he looked at the 20 people standing at the door with crossbows. He left. He didn't come back. Hannah became the senior blacksmith. Not by appointment, by fact. She forged better than Daniel. Faster, more precisely, cleaner. He wasn't jealous. He was proud. A teacher who isn't proud of a student who's better than himself is a bad teacher. She led 12 blacksmiths, half a woman. Gord had long since stopped talking about omens. Maeve commanded the Confederation's armed forces. 120 archers, 30 halberdiers, 20 cavalrymen. A signal network of mirrors and whistles covered a territory a day's journey in every direction. No detachment could approach unnoticed. Baron Hask tried twice. The first time, he sent 40 horsemen to collect taxes. They were met on the bridge by 80 crossbowmen. Not a single shot was fired. The horsemen turned around and rode away. The second time, Hask came himself. He looked around. He assessed the situation. He left. A month later, he sent a letter. He proposed a trade agreement on equal terms. Eloise replied, politely, positively, with terms that Hask found hard to refuse. Hask accepted. He wasn't stupid. He understood that the tide had turned. Eloise became the face of the Confederation. Her gloves had become legendary. Everyone knew what lay beneath them, and everyone knew that these laundresses' hands had negotiated with barons and merchants, and won. She was no longer ashamed. Once, during negotiations in Tiermond, she took off her gloves. She placed her hands on the table. The merchants watched. She said, "These are the hands that washed other people's laundry, and now they're signing contracts." This is what Holmgard stands for: the right to work, the right to learn, the right to be valued not by birth, but by skill. The merchants were silent. Then they signed. Soyan sent the third set of blueprints to Haran, along with a cover letter. She wrote that she hadn't found a master. She had found the future, and that this future smelled of coal and wet iron and fresh bread, and that it was worth every word in her notebook. Daniel didn't read the letter. Soyan didn't show it to him. But one evening she sat next to him by the fire and talked about home, about Haran, about her father who had been poisoned, about how she'd spent her whole life searching for a place where knowledge doesn't kill the one who carries it. Daniel listened. Then he said she hadn't found it yet. Because knowledge is always dangerous to the one who carries it. The difference is whether he carries it alone or with those who will have his back. So-yeon looked at him. For a long time. Then she said he said strange things for a blacksmith. Daniel replied that he was a strange blacksmith. So-yeon smiled. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, she smiled not out of politeness, but genuinely. The runic vein. It wouldn't leave him alone. Daniel continued his experiments. He changed the frequency. He changed the amplitude. The vein responded more and more strongly. The glow grew brighter. The lines in the stone pulsed, no longer blue, but white. Hot. Alive. Alvin went down into the mine with him once. He looked. He touched the wall. He pulled his hand back. He looked at Daniel. He said that it wasn't iron. It was the blood of the earth. And that Daniel had awakened it with the strike of his hammer. Just as a mother awakens a child with the beating of her heart. Daniel didn't correct him. Alvin's metaphor was more precise than any scientific explanation. He didn't know what to do with the vein. He didn't know how to mine runic metal. He didn't know how to process it. He didn't know how to use it. But he knew one thing. The vein was alive. And it responded to vibrations. And if he learned to speak to it correctly, maybe it would give him something no technology could. Maybe it would give him magic. Not that old magic that required the chosen few. New magic. Magic that works through a mechanism, through a hammer, through a machine. Magic accessible to anyone with hands and a head. Industrial magic. He wrote this idea down on a tablet and gave it to So-yeon. She read it, looked at him, said it was madness. Then she wrote it down in her notebook. With a note, important madness. Spring of the third year, late March. News from the south. The Royal Army, 3,000 spears. Finally assembled, it set out. The new Lord Chancellor turned out to be no less persistent than grave, only smarter. He didn't want a bloodbath. He wanted an example, to crush the rebellion, to show everyone what happens to those who defy the crown. The army marched north, slowly, with difficulty. 3,000 men, a supply train, siege engines, a 2-week march. Maeve convened a council, the final council. She laid out the map, the one drawn by Lyra, an accurate one, with distances and elevations. 3,000 against 120. The math was simple, deadly. Maeve said they'd hold the bridge for 3 days. The mill for 2 more. The village for 1. On the 7th day, it would all be over. Unless a miracle happened. Daniel said there would be no miracle. There would be engineering. And a plan. Eloise left the next day, for Tiermont, with their last trump card. Daniel worked day and night. Building, digging, forging. Everyone was building. Everyone was digging. Everyone was forging. Even the children carried stones. Lyra never left the drafting table. She drew what Daniel didn't have time to explain in words. She saw his thoughts in his sketches and turned them into blueprints. A 13-year-old girl who became his right-hand woman, his first engineer, his sister. The army took up position on the south bank of the River Mern 12 days later. 3,000 spears, tents, banners, the glint of steel. From the walls of Home Guard, one could see the ant-like mass of people filling the field on the opposite bank. Maeve stood next to Daniel. She counted silently. Then she said there were more cavalry than she'd thought. 400 horsemen. The rest were infantry. 3 siege engines, battering rams, aimed at stone walls, which Home Guard doesn't have. So they're targeting the gates. Daniel watched. Then he turned. He went into the house. He took off his work apron. He put on a clean shirt. He tucked the scroll under his arm, and he walked toward the bridge. Alone. Maeve grabbed his arm. He looked at her. She didn't let go. She stared. Her eyes were like a wolf's, frenzied. She said she wouldn't let him go. He said he had to. She said they'd kill him. He said they wouldn't, because they needed the vein, and only he knew where the vein was. Dead, he'd be useless. Maeve was silent. Then she let go. Slowly. Her fingers unclenched one by one. He walked away. Across the bridge. Across the river. Alone. In the work apron he'd put back on because taking it off felt wrong. The apron is who he is. An engineer. Not a knight. Not a baron. Not a rebel. an engineer. Behind him stood people, not an army, artisans. 600 people from 7 villages. They had all come, every single one, with tools in their hands. Hannah with a hammer, Olvin with pliers, Kern with an axe, Maeve with a crossbow, Iris with a leather bag full of herbs and bandages, Eloise. She'd returned from Tiermond last night, just in time. She stood there in gloves, her back straight. She wasn't holding account books. Something else. Soyon had a notebook. Lyra had a sketchpad. The 13-year-old girl stood in the front row, not trembling. Theo was holding Ronan's hand. He was almost 5. He didn't understand what was happening, but he wasn't afraid, because everyone he knew was standing right there beside him. Daniel reached the middle of the bridge. He stopped. From the other side, a horseman rode up to the bridge, the royal envoy, in full court regalia. Behind him were 10 more horsemen. The envoy stopped. He looked at Daniel, at his apron, at the scroll under his arm, at the people behind him. Daniel unrolled the scroll. He placed it on the bridge railing. A blueprint, a steam plow. His main project of the last 2 months, a mechanism that could plow as much land in a day as 20 oxen could in a week. He spoke calmly, without a tremor, without grandstanding, like an engineer presenting a project. He said that they were not at war with the king, that they were not rebels, that they were craftsmen. He said that here was the blueprint, a plow. It would plow 10 acres a day. If the king wanted, they would build 1,000 of them, for free, on one condition. Every peasant who worked with this plow would be a free man. The ambassador looked at the blueprint, for a long time. Then he looked up at Daniel, then at the people behind him, at the 600 men with tools, not weapons, tools, who stood tall, who were unafraid. Then Eloise stepped forward. She took off her gloves. She unfurled the document, the Tiermond Treaty, signed by the 3 free cities, Tiermond, Crestvale, and Marlow Harbor, the 3rd city that had previously refused. Eloise had convinced it. The treaty stated that if the Crown used force against the Confederation of the Northern Workshops, the 3 free cities would close their ports to royal ships. A trade blockade. Salt, cloth, tin, copper, southern spices, everything that comes by sea. The Crown would lose half its trade. In the midst of the war with Valharat, that would be death, not military but economic. The ambassador read it. He turned pale. He reread it. He rolled it up. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Eloise. He stood in silence for a long time. Then he rolled up the drawing of D. Daniel, carefully, as if it were a precious object, and he bowed. For the first time in 100 years, a royal ambassador bowed to a commoner. Not to Daniel, to the drawing, to what lay behind it. The ambassador turned his horse around. He rode away. 2 hours later, the camp on the south bank began to break up. The tents came down one by one. The army was leaving, slowly, reluctantly. But it was leaving, because the war with Valharat was too costly, and because 3 ports are 3 ports, and because a plow that plows 10 acres a day is worth more than a burned-down village. Daniel stood on the bridge and watched. Maeve stood behind him. Hannah, Kieran, Alvin, Soyon, Iris, Eloise, Gort, everyone. Lyra approached, quietly. She took his hand, a small hand in his large one. She was silent. Then she said what she hadn't said in 3 years. One word. Brother. Then another. She said that he really was her brother, no matter who he had been before. Daniel looked at the river. The water flowed. Fast. Springtime. Cold. He stood on the bridge he had built, among the people he had gathered, with the sister he hadn't betrayed. He remembered the night shift, Seoul, the parking lot, the screech of brakes, the stroller, his hands pushing against the plastic side, the impact, the darkness, and the ashes in which he had woken up. A year, 3 years, a whole lifetime. He's an engineer from Seoul. He repaired washing machines on the weekends, for free, because he couldn't stand to see people pay for something that takes 20 minutes to fix. Now he stands on a bridge over a river in a world where there were no washing machines, and he refuses the power they offer him. And he hands out blueprints that others hide. And he builds a world where a tool is not a sin but a right. He didn't become a king. He didn't conquer the world. He didn't gain magical powers. He gained something else. A family. A workshop. People who stand behind him not because he's strong, but because he gave them what no one else had. The chance to work and not be ashamed of it. A tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away, because engineers don't cry, but people do. And he had long since been both. Lyra squeezed his hand tighter. Ronan, down by the bridge, was laughing and pointing at the ducks in the river. Theo stood nearby, looking at the water. No pot in her hands. No fear in her eyes. Martha was setting out bowls on the bank. It was time for lunch. The war was over. The bread was ready. The children were hungry. The hammer behind his back was tapping. Thud. 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 It would keep thudding tomorrow, and in a year, and in 10, and in 100. Because once upon a time, an engineer woke up in the ashes and decided to start with the roof.